Hello, my dear friends. Victorians once ate dishes so strange that many of them would be unrecognisable on a modern table. Beneath their polished manners hid a world of flavours shaped by survival, scarcity, and ambition. Some delicacies vanished quietly, others disappeared for reasons no one expected. Tonight we step back into that forgotten kitchen and taste the history they left behind. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one wandered through the dining rooms of Victorian households, the presence of ornate tureens filled with steaming mock turtle soup would have signalled refinement and status. The dish appeared elegant, dark and rich, imitating the luxurious green turtle soup that only the wealthiest families could afford. Yet few guests ever questioned the true origins of what they were eating. Cooks knew how to craft the illusion, boiling calf heads until the flesh softened into gelatinous folds that resembled the prized texture of turtle meat. The broth thickened into a glossy sheen, and the aroma carried a deceptive sense of quality, far removed from the cheap ingredients simmering beneath the surface. For many middle-class families eager to emulate aristocratic tastes, this soup became a doorway into a world of imagined opulence. They could not pay for imported turtle, but they could purchase calves discarded from the slaughterhouses at low cost and transform them into something that felt grand enough for guests. The result was a dish that looked sophisticated, but carried within it the contradictions of Victorian life, where appearances often mattered more than truth. Markets supplied endless calf heads, eyes still intact, the bone exposed, the tongue hanging limp beneath the jaw. Vendors chopped them quickly, barely rinsing away the grit before passing them to households or cheap eateries. Once in the kitchen, the head was thrown into boiling water, releasing a heavy smell that seeped into the walls and clung to every surface. The fat rose in pale bubbles, forming a greasy layer that cooks skimmed off again and again, though it never completely disappeared. Workers in large establishments stirred massive pots for hours, their hands stiff from the heat, while gelatin oozed from the simmering bones. The resulting texture was meant to mimic turtle meat, but anyone who saw the preparation knew how far removed the dish truly was from the delicacy it attempted to replace. Recipes instructed cooks to scrape the softened flesh from around the skull, ears and jaw, mixing these pieces with herbs and sherry to disguise the smell. The broth absorbed the taste of bones, cartilage and sinew, transforming into a dark liquid that appeared refined only once poured into polished china bowls. Some establishments added artificial colouring to achieve the deep greenish tint associated with real turtle soup, creating a more convincing illusion for diners eager to believe they were tasting luxury. The deception was so normalised that few questioned it, even when the meat carried the faint metallic taste of unclean pots or the sour hint of aging animal fat. Guests sipped the soup with satisfaction, unaware of the unhygienic conditions behind the kitchen door. Restaurants embraced mock turtle soup because it was cheap to produce, yet could be sold at a premium. In crowded dining spaces, bowls were served one after another, each portion ladled from the same pot that had been simmering all day. Flies drifted near the edges, attracted by the warmth and smell, but they were ignored as long as the service remained steady. Street vendors sold a thinner version from mobile carts, the pot balanced over a small fire as steam mingled with soot from the city air. Workers bought it on cold evenings because it was filling, though the taste varied wildly depending on the quality of the calf head used. Some portions contained small fragments of bone that scraped the tongue, but customers accepted it without complaint, knowing that food safety was not a guarantee in their world. The allure of the soup came from what it represented, rather than what it truly was. Victorian society prized imitation, celebrating the ability to appear refined even when wealth was limited. Mock turtle soup allowed families to host dinners that felt respectable, offering guests something that resembled a high-class dish without the overwhelming expense. Yet beneath the tablecloths and candlelight, there remained the unsettling truth that diners were consuming the boiled remnants of slaughterhouse waste. The contrast between expectation and reality was stark, though largely invisible to those who preferred not to look closely at the origins of their meals. Writers of the era commented on the rising popularity of the soup, noting that it appeared everywhere from royal banquets to modest boarding houses. What they did not emphasize was how often it became a vessel for unsafe practices. Improperly cleaned calf heads carried bacteria from the marketplace, and long cooking times did not always eliminate the risk. Pots encrusted with old grease were reused day after day, adding layers of contamination that blended seamlessly into the broth. Diners who fell ill rarely blamed the soup, attributing sickness instead to the general unhealthiness of urban life. Illness was so common that few considered the possibility that their elegant supper carried hidden dangers. Even so, the soup endured, supported by an economy built on the use of every possible part of an animal. Waste was not tolerated, and calf heads represented an opportunity that cooks exploited with ingenuity and deception. The dish became a symbol of how Victorian society navigated scarcity and aspiration, blending resourcefulness with a desire to imitate the wealthy. It is easy to imagine a table filled with polite conversation, silver spoons tapping the rims of bowls as guests believed they were indulging in something rare, while the truth remained simmering quietly beneath the surface. In the end, mock turtle soup reveals more about Victorian dreams than Victorian diets. It shows a culture willing to transform discarded parts into symbols of sophistication and a public eager to consume illusions. The soup tasted of sherry, spices, and effort, but beneath those flavors lay the unmistakable presence of bone and gristle, softened into a texture that mimicked luxury without ever achieving it. The story of mock turtle soup highlights how Victorians valued appearances over origins, embracing a dish born from necessity and illusion. This desire for imitation opened the door to foods that were not merely questionable, but truly dangerous. The next delicacy reveals how a seemingly simple street snack could embody a far more disturbing reality, when writhing freshwater eels were boiled, cooled, and left quivering in their own gelatin until they resembled chunks of trembling flesh, served to the public without hesitation. The streets of Victorian London offered an endless parade of noises, smells, and hurried footsteps. Yet one of the most familiar sights to anyone walking through the markets was the wide metal tray of jellied eels set at the front of a vendor's cart. The dish sat exposed to the open air, its pale pieces of eel suspended inside a trembling mass of cooled broth that glistened whenever sunlight or lamplight struck it. For the working poor who moved through these markets each day, the dish was more than food. It was a dependable answer to hunger in a world where dependability rarely existed. Chopped freshwater eels, once pulled from the murky Thames, were dropped into boiling pots and left to cook until their bodies softened and released the gelatin that thickened the broth naturally. When cooled, the mixture formed a jelly that held everything together, giving the dish its iconic wobbling appearance that some found comforting and others quietly unsettling. Vendors prepared the eels with a simplicity born from necessity rather than hygiene. They worked quickly, slicing the animals into chunks with knives that had cut countless other things before them, often without washing between tasks. The boards they used were slick with river residue and old fish scales, yet this was considered normal. Once the pieces were placed into the pot, the smell that rose was sharp and heavy, drifting beyond the stalls and settling into the narrow alleys where customers lined up with coins tightly clutched in hand. The broth bubbled for hours, darkening as the cooking continued, while the vendor stirred occasionally with a wooden ladle stained from years of use. As evening came, the pot was removed from the fire and left to cool, the liquid turning into a firm jelly that could be sliced or scooped. By morning, it would be ready to sell. Those who bought the dish rarely questioned its source. Unaid hung left little room for scrutiny, and the price was low enough that almost anyone could afford a serving. Men heading to factories in the early hours stopped for a quick portion to warm their stomachs. Women shopping for their families bought small bowls to carry home, wrapped in old cloth to keep the jelly from slipping. Children gathered near the stalls, watching the wobbling pieces with curiosity before receiving a serving of their own. The dish became woven into the rhythm of daily life, eaten without ceremony and discussed without hesitation, because it filled the gap between scarcity and survival. In a city where even bread could be expensive during certain seasons, jellied eels felt like a small, accessible relief. Yet the comfort people found in the dish masked a far more troubling reality. The Thames, from which most of the eels were taken, was notorious for its filth. It acted as both a waterway and a dumping ground, carrying waste from homes, factories, and slaughterhouses. The eels surviving within it absorbed everything around them, storing contaminants in their bodies long before they reached the market stall. The process of boiling them did little to erase these dangers, though few customers knew enough to question it. Illness moved so freely through densely packed neighbourhoods that families attributed stomach pains or fevers to the city itself, rather than to any particular food they ate. In an era without strict food regulations, vendors operated on trust, and buyers accepted that trust because they had no alternative. The jelly itself became a symbol of the era's contradictions. People saw its firmness as a sign of quality, unaware that the same gelatin came from the breakdown of flesh saturated with the river's pollution. The thicker the jelly, the more appealing it seemed to customers, even as it carried traces of everything the eel had consumed. Vendors took pride in producing a firm, glossy mass that held its shape on a spoon, believing it reflected skill and freshness. In truth, it revealed the extent to which nature had been reshaped by industrial life. Each portion sold on the street carried a hint of the river's decay, transformed into a meal by necessity rather than choice. Despite these hidden dangers, the dish persisted because it represented survival. Victorian London was harsh and unpredictable, and food that was cheap, filling, and familiar held a powerful appeal. Eating jellied eels meant accepting the risks of the city while acknowledging its limited opportunities. Families who lived on narrow margins learned to value whatever nourishment they could find. The wobbling jelly on their plates was a reminder that their lives were shaped not by preference, but by circumstance. It was a dish born from the working class, sustained by the working class, and remembered as a reflection of the era's broader struggles. In understanding jellied eels, one begins to understand Victorian London itself, a place where poverty dictated diet, where danger blended easily into routine, and where food could be both comforting and contaminated at the same time. The dish survived not because it was safe or refined, but because it offered a kind of steadiness in a world dominated by uncertainty. Every serving carried the weight of the river, the labour behind the vendor's cart, and the desperation that shaped the daily meals of millions. Jellied eels reveal how necessity shaped Victorian diets, turning polluted river creatures into a daily staple for those who had no safer options. This fragile balance between hunger and risk led to even stranger forms of nourishment, including a dessert-like jelly made by boiling calves' feet until they dissolved into a translucent mass, served to the sick as though it were a gift of health. The belief that food could restore strength shaped many Victorian household kitchens, and few dishes embodied this conviction more clearly than calf's foot jelly. It appeared delicate and harmless, a pale, shimmering mould often placed on small plates beside a cup of weak tea, especially in the rooms of the sick and the elderly. To those who prepared it, the dish symbolised care and duty. To those who consumed it, it represented hope, a hope that nourishment extracted from bone and sinew could somehow coax the body back to health. The jelly wobbled gently when touched, catching the light like a piece of translucent glass, yet its appearance concealed the harsh, laborious process behind its creation. It was not a luxury dessert, but a product of long boiling, scraping, and straining, where every trace of the calf's foot was reduced until only gelatin and residue remained. For Victorian families, this was considered medicine as much as food. The making of calf's foot jelly began with a sight that few would connect to the final dish. Slaughterhouses sent out buckets of severed calf's feet, still bearing patches of hide and specks of dirt clinging to the creases. Cooks first singed the remaining hair over open flames, a task that filled the kitchen with a bitter smell that lingered long after the fire cooled. The feet were then scrubbed repeatedly, though complete cleanliness was rarely achieved. Once prepared, they were placed into large pots, often alongside bits of bone or unused scraps, and submerged in water. The pots simmered for hours, sometimes overnight, until the bones loosened and the connective tissues dissolved. As the water thickened, a greasy foam rose to the surface, which the cook skimmed away with steady, practiced motions. The resulting liquid was far from appetizing at this stage. It carried a dull grey colour and an aroma that hinted at the raw beginnings of the dish. To transform it into something suitable for a patient, or at least socially acceptable, cooks strained the broth through cloth to remove loose fragments of bone and softened skin. Sugar, lemon peel, nutmeg or sherry was often added to disguise the smell of boiled cartilage. These ingredients created the illusion of delicacy, giving the jelly a faint sweetness and a pleasant fragrance that masked its origins. Once poured into moulds and left to cool, the broth solidified into a quivering, translucent mass that looked almost elegant on a plate. It was easy to forget the calf's foot entirely. Families served the jelly with an earnest belief in its healing powers. Doctors of the time promoted gelatin as a restorative substance, claiming it could strengthen weak bodies, replenish lost energy, and soothe the stomach. Mothers fed it to their children when they were feverish or pale. Older relatives received it when appetite failed, encouraged to swallow small spoonfuls that dissolved slowly on the tongue. The dish was eaten quietly, often in dim rooms where windows were shuttered to keep out the cold, and where the patient's shallow breathing filled the silence. Though modern understanding of nutrition offers little support for these beliefs, the jelly remained a comforting ritual during illness, a symbol of attentive care even when results were uncertain. Yet behind this tenderness lay the same contradictions seen throughout Victorian food culture. Cleanliness was inconsistent, ingredients were seldom monitored, and contaminated scraps were often repurposed out of necessity. Calf's feet came from animals that had lived in crowded urban conditions, fed on cheap refuse, and slaughtered in facilities where hygiene was minimal. The boiling process might have softened the tissues, but it did not erase every danger. Strange broth could still contain impurities or bacteria, making the dish far from the harmless medicine families believed it to be. Illnesses that worsened after consuming the jelly were rarely linked to the food. Instead, they were blamed on the weakness of the patient or the severity of the original ailment. Despite this, calf's foot jelly endured because it offered a sense of control in situations defined by uncertainty. Victorian households faced constant threats from disease, malnutrition, and cold. A dish that promised recovery felt valuable, even if its effects were more emotional than physical. Preparing it required patience and dedication, providing families with something tangible they could do for those they loved. The jelly also reflected a broader cultural desire to extract usefulness from every part of an animal. Waste was unacceptable in a society where many struggled to afford even basic foods. A calf's foot, humble and unappealing on its own, became a symbol of resourcefulness when transformed into a restorative dessert. Calf's foot jelly reveals how Victorian ideals of nourishment were shaped by tradition, limited scientific understanding, and a deep need for reassurance. The translucent mould on the plate suggested purity and care, even though it was born from hours of boiling bones that most people preferred not to imagine. It represented both the tenderness of families trying to heal one another and the harsh reality of a time when nutritional myths guided medical hope. In the glow of candlelight, the jelly trembled slightly with each breath of the patient who lifted their spoon, unaware of how closely comfort and misconception intertwined. Calf's foot jelly shows how Victorians placed their trust in foods that promised strength, even when their origins were far from comforting. Such faith in gelatinous remedies opened the door to even stranger household practices, where preservation blurred into quiet risk. The next delicacy reveals how families stored cooked meats beneath a thick layer of congealed fat through the long winter months, hiding both nourishment and the slow creep of decay beneath the same pale surface. Winter in Victorian households brought a particular urgency into the kitchen, a quiet pressure that pushed families to preserve whatever food they could before the cold tightened its hold. Potted meats emerged from this need for security, a form of preservation that relied on simmered scraps pressed tightly into jars and sealed beneath a cooling layer of fat. At first glance, the jars looked simple and reassuring, lined neatly on shelves or tucked into dark corners of the pantry. Their pale surfaces appeared firm and clean, suggesting stability in a season defined by scarcity. Yet beneath that smooth lid lay a mixture shaped by poverty, improvisation, and the unpredictable conditions of crowded kitchens, where every scrap of animal flesh had value. Preparing potted meats began with choosing whatever cuts were available, and for many families, this meant pieces discarded by butchers or leftovers from a larger meal. These scraps were placed into pots with salt and spices, then boiled until they softened into fibres that could be shredded or mashed into paste. The process filled small kitchens with a heavy, lingering aroma that clung to clothing and walls, a reminder that preservation required hours of slow, patient work. After cooking, the meat was carefully pressed into jars, each layer compacted to remove air pockets. Once filled, the jars waited as a pot of rendered fat melted on the stove, turning clear and thin as it heated. The fat was then poured over the meat, slowly coating the surface until no trace of the mixture beneath remained. As it cooled, the fat hardened into a firm seal meant to protect the contents from air and decay. Households of different economic classes approached this practice in very different environments. Wealthier homes, with their spacious kitchens and paid cooks, carried out the preparation methodically. Clean surfaces, stable temperatures, and fresh ingredients made the process feel almost refined. Jars were labelled with dates and stacked with care. In contrast, working-class families preserved meat in cramped, dimly lit rooms where tables served multiple purposes, and cleanliness was often a luxury rather than a standard. Fat reused from previous meals was common, as wasting even a spoonful felt unthinkable. Air floated thick with dust, and utensils served countless functions in a single day. Despite these challenges, the method remained a trusted tradition, passed down through generations and treated as reliable as long as the fat seal stayed unbroken. Trust, however, did not always align with safety. A small crack in the hardened fat could allow air to slip inside unnoticed. Spoilage often began quietly, hidden beneath a surface that looked just as smooth and pale as any other jar on the shelf. Families discovered the truth only when opening the container, pulling back the seal to find meat that smelled sour, metallic, or disturbingly sweet. Some households discarded spoiled jars immediately, burdened by the loss, but unwilling to take the risk. Others, pressed by hunger or limited resources, convinced themselves that strange odours were harmless signs of aging and ate the contents anyway. Illnesses that followed, stomach aches, fevers, and bouts of weakness, were chalked up to the season's hardships rather than linked to the jars themselves. Without a modern understanding of bacteria or contamination, people assumed winter sickness was unavoidable. Despite these dangers, potted meats carried emotional weight that made them hard to abandon. In a time when winters could stretch harsh and unpredictable, jars stored along a shelf symbolized survival. Each container represented a choice made months earlier, the choice to prepare, to labour, to hope for a calmer season. Mothers took pride in filling as many jars as possible, believing they were protecting their families from hunger. Fathers relied on the jars when work slowed or wages dropped, knowing that even a small portion could sustain them when fresh food became scarce. Children learned early to recognize the pale layer of fat as a sign of reassurance, even if they did not understand what lay beneath it. The cultural value of this method extended beyond individual homes. Potted meats embodied Victorian ideals of thrift and resourcefulness, traits celebrated in a society where waste was frowned upon. Using every part of an animal was seen not merely as practical, but as virtuous. This mindset blurred the line between necessity and danger, encouraging practices that made sense in theory, but could falter under real conditions. As cities grew and food markets became more complex, the risks associated with poorly preserved meat increased, yet tradition kept the jars on shelves year after year. Examining this practice reveals how Victorian households balanced caution with determined optimism. The fat seal served as both shield and symbol, hiding the uncertainty beneath with quiet confidence. Opening a jar became a moment of hope each winter, sometimes rewarded, sometimes betrayed. In rooms lit by weak daylight or flickering lamps, families trusted that the work they had done in autumn would carry them through the cold. Even when doubts lingered, they continued the ritual because it offered the illusion of control in a world that rarely guaranteed safety. Potted meats show how deeply Victorians depended on fragile preservation techniques to endure difficult seasons. Beneath each smooth layer of fat rested the constant tension between survival and risk, a tension that shaped how families approached food in the harshest months of the year. Potted meats reveal how Victorian households relied on sealed jars that concealed both nourishment and hidden danger through the coldest months. Such fragile trust in preserved scraps set the stage for even bolder morning meals, where spiced kidneys sizzled in crowded kitchens and filled the air with a sharp, unsettling heat long before sunrise. Morning in Victorian London began with hurried footsteps, dim kitchens, and the sharp crackle of hot pans warming over coal fires. Among the meals prepared at dawn, devilled kidneys stood out as one of the most familiar scents drifting through narrow streets and boarding houses. The dish was quick, intense, and unmistakable. Sheep kidneys, sliced and cleaned only briefly, were tossed into pans with mustard, cayenne, pepper, and vinegar, then seared over high heat until the mixture hissed and spat against the metal. The result was a breakfast that arrived with force, fiery, pungent, and heavy enough to carry workers through long mornings of physical labour. It was not gentle food, nor refined, but it matched the pace of Victorian life, where strength mattered more than subtlety, and those who rose before sunrise needed something that struck fast and stayed with them. Preparation began long before the pan grew hot. Markets sold kidneys cheaply, piled in open trays beside other offal that many families depended on. Vendors rinsed them quickly in cold water, their hands stained from hours of handling organs. Customers carried them home wrapped in paper, often still releasing a faint metallic smell that clung stubbornly to fingers. In kitchens, the kidneys were trimmed, though rarely with precision. Any remaining membrane was considered acceptable, as long as the slicing was quick. Once cut into small pieces, they were placed directly into bowls of seasoning. Mustard powder burned the nose, cayenne left a lingering sting in the air, and black pepper settled into the wooden cracks of the table. The mixture soaked into the meat, coating every surface before the kidneys met the heat. When the pan finally touched the fire, the transformation was immediate. Fat melted rapidly, forming a shallow pool where the kidneys sizzled and curled at the edges. Steam rose with a fierce aroma that filled even the smallest rooms. For families living in single-room dwellings, the smell drifted into bedding, clothing, and the hallways beyond. Children woke to it, workers relied on it, and neighbours recognised it instantly as the unmistakable beginning of a workday. Toast waited nearby, often charred slightly around the edges, ready to absorb the spicy juices that collected in the bottom of the pan. The dish was eaten quickly, sometimes standing at the table, sometimes while walking out the door, because time in the morning was as scarce as comfort. Devilled kidneys held a practical appeal beyond their flavour. They cooked in minutes, used the cheapest cuts available, and required no special equipment. Offal was abundant and rarely wasted, making it a natural choice for households with limited budgets. The dish also reflected Victorian attitudes toward food, where strength and heat were believed to invigorate the body. A spicy breakfast felt like preparation for the cold factories, mines, and workshops that awaited thousands of workers. Few questioned the hygiene or quality of the kidneys they consumed. Illness was common in every neighbourhood, and people attributed their discomfort to the city's poor air, water, or overcrowding, rather than to the fiery dish that began their mornings. The dish revealed deeper cultural preferences as well. Victorians embraced offal with a familiarity that modern diners might find surprising. Organs were woven naturally into their diets, appearing in pies, puddings, sausages, and stews. Eating kidneys for breakfast fits seamlessly into this culinary landscape. No part of an animal was considered too humble to serve. In fact, the strong flavour of offal was often seen as a virtue rather than something to overcome. A dish that struck the palate with intensity was believed to stimulate appetite and energy, traits valued in a society built on constant labour. Devilled kidneys became a meal associated with endurance, a small ritual of fortification performed before facing another exhausting day. Yet the dish also carried risks disguised beneath its speed and convenience. Poor handling of offal could spread illness, especially in kitchens where water was scarce, utensils were shared, and surfaces were rarely disinfected. Some kidneys came from animals exposed to disease, and spoilage was not always noticeable once spices masked the scent. Cooking them thoroughly reduced some dangers, but not all, especially when fires burned too low or pans were overcrowded. Still, families accepted these risks because hunger and routine left little room for hesitation. A meal that offered warmth, sharpness, and fullness was too valuable to abandon, even when its preparation bordered on unsafe. Devilled kidneys held a place in Victorian society that reflected more than breakfast habits. They embodied the era's relationship with food, fast, forceful, and shaped by necessity. The dish connected households across class lines, appearing in modest homes as well as in gentlemen's clubs, though prepared with differing levels of refinement. Regardless of the setting, its heat, smell, and intensity remained unmistakable. It was a meal that left an impression not just on the tongue, but on the atmosphere of every kitchen where it was made. Workers stepping into the morning cold carried its warmth with them, a fleeting comfort in a world that demanded much and gave little. Understanding devilled kidneys means understanding the relentless pace of Victorian mornings, the reliance on cheap ingredients, and the acceptance of flavours that pushed the boundaries of comfort. It was food that felt alive in the pan and forceful in the mouth, a dish that asked for nothing delicate or cautious from those who consumed it. Its place in history stands as a reminder of how people shaped their meals to fit the weight of their days. Devilled kidneys reveal how Victorians embraced intense flavours drawn from the cheapest parts of the animal, building their mornings on speed, heat, and necessity. That same willingness to consume what was available led to a soup served in clubs and dining rooms across the country, a dark broth whose reputation far exceeded the modest ingredients simmering in the pot. Brown Windsor soup held a reputation that stretched far beyond the modest ingredients simmering in its pot, becoming a fixture in Victorian dining rooms, gentlemen's clubs, and the crowded eateries that lined busy streets. The dish carried a weight of familiarity, a sense that any establishment offering proper English fare would have it ready at almost any hour. Its appearance was simple, a dark, thickened broth with small pieces of beef and vegetables, ladled steaming into deep bowls. Yet for many Victorians, the soup represented more than nourishment. It was a symbol of national identity, a meal that felt sturdy, predictable, and suited to the cold dampness of England's climate. Even those who questioned its flavour rarely questioned its presence, because brown Windsor soup seemed to belong as naturally to the era as coal smoke or heavy wool coats. Preparation began with beef, an ingredient that varied widely in quality depending on the kitchen. In wealthier establishments, cooks selected cuts that had enough fat to enrich the broth without overwhelming it. In poorer kitchens and working-class eateries, scraps sufficed. Bones, cartilage and connective tissue went into the pot, along with chopped root vegetables. Everything was browned first, a step that produced the soup's deep colour and filled the kitchen with a scent both comforting and earthy. Once browned, the mixture simmered for hours, gradually dissolving into a thick consistency that Victorians associated with heartiness. The steam clouded the windows and softened the wooden cabinets, settling into every corner of the kitchen, while cooks stirred the pot with slow, rhythmic motions. Restaurants served the soup in large quantities, and the pot was rarely empty. As long as the broth remained thick and dark, customers believed it was wholesome. Few asked what cuts of meat were used, and fewer still wondered how often the pot was cleaned between batches. In some establishments, the soup never fully cooled. Instead, it was replenished continuously throughout the day as ingredients were added, cooked down, and replaced again. This method ensured consistency of flavour, but blurred the line between fresh preparation and perpetual reuse. Still, diners accepted it without hesitation. Brown Windsor soup was too common to provoke suspicion. It was part of the ordinary rhythm of Victorian life, consumed by travellers, businessmen, clerks and labourers alike. Gentlemen's clubs offered a more polished version of the dish. Served in gleaming bowls on heavy tables, the soup marked the beginning of formal dinners or accompanied quiet conversations by the fire. Yet even in these refined spaces, its essence remained unchanged. The soup's darkness concealed the simplest ingredients, hiding imperfections beneath a sheen of respectability. Members enjoyed it because it felt traditionally English, a dish that echoed the country's values of stability and restraint. The flavour was mild, the texture dense, and the presentation unassuming, a combination that appealed to those who valued familiarity over innovation. In contrast, the working poor saw the soup as an affordable source of warmth. In modest eateries, bowls were served with thick bread that helped stretch the meal. The beef was often tough or minimal, but the broth filled the stomach and softened the cold. These establishments relied on the soup because it was inexpensive to make and difficult to spoil, at least in appearance. A few more vegetables, a handful of barley, or another ladle of old broth could extend the pot through the busiest hours. Diners accepted the variations from bowl to bowl, knowing that taste mattered less than fullness. The soup became a quiet equalizer across the city. Rich or poor, anyone might end up with a spoon in hand, leaning over the same dark liquid that countless others had consumed. Despite its reliability, brown Windsor soup carried risks common to Victorian kitchens. Meat of questionable freshness sometimes went unnoticed after hours of simmering. Pots that were never fully scrubbed accumulated residues that shaped the flavour in ways diners could not detect. Vegetables washed in contaminated water brought invisible hazards. Yet these dangers blended seamlessly into the era's broader landscape of food insecurity. People trusted warmth, thickness, and tradition. They believed a dark bowl of soup could steady the body, even if its safety depended on countless unseen variables. When illness followed, few made the connection. In a city rife with pollution and disease, a bowl of soup rarely received blame. Understanding brown Windsor soup means understanding the Victorian attachment to foods that represented endurance. The dish was not innovative or refined, but it was steady, filling, and present everywhere. It fit the temperament of an age defined by rapid industrial change and harsh urban living. In homes and restaurants alike, it created a moment of quiet familiarity, a pause of warmth in days otherwise marked by uncertainty. Its simplicity became its strength, allowing it to flourish as a national emblem even as its ingredients remained humble. Brown Windsor soup stands as a reminder that comfort often comes from the most unassuming places. Beneath its dark surface lay a reflection of Victorian resilience, practicality, and the desire for meals that anchored people to a sense of stability in a restless world. Brown Windsor soup reveals how Victorians relied on dark, heavy broths to provide warmth and familiarity amid difficult lives, accepting its murky origins without question. Such trust in simple dishes paved the way for smaller meals that carried surprising intensity, including toasted bread spread with mashed sardines that filled afternoon parlours with a sharp, oily aroma. Afternoons in Victorian households unfolded with quieter rhythms than the hurried mornings, marked by the gentle clink of teacups, the soft hum of conversation, and the appearance of simple foods meant to satisfy without interrupting the calm. Sardine toast became one of the era's most familiar offerings, a small dish that bridged the gap between modest budgets and the desire for refinement. Its preparation was uncomplicated: canned sardines mashed into a smooth, oily paste and spread across slices of crisp, freshly toasted bread. The result carried a distinct aroma that drifted through parlours and dining rooms, announcing its presence long before it touched the plate. Despite its humility, the dish fit neatly into Victorian tea culture, providing a savoury contrast to sweet cakes and pastries. It appeared in both middle-class homes and working households, a testament to the accessibility of canned fish that transformed a simple toast into something that felt unexpectedly indulgent. Canned sardines held a special place in Victorian kitchens because they represented technological progress. The rise of preserved foods allowed families to access ingredients that once spoiled quickly or needed to be eaten near the source. Factories packed sardines tightly into tins, filled with oil or brine, sealing them for months at a time. This convenience made the fish affordable and widely available, especially in urban areas where fresh seafood cost more than many families could spare. Opening a can required only a small knife or key, releasing the rich scent of fish preserved in oil. The sardines were soft, easily separated with a fork until they formed a spreadable mixture. A pinch of salt or pepper improved the flavour, though most households relied on the natural taste of the fish to carry the dish. Toast provided the necessary structure. Thick slices of bread were placed near open flames or on griddles until their edges browned and crisped. The warmth of the toast softened the oily paste as it spread, allowing it to cling to every corner of the surface. Once prepared, the toast was served immediately, ideally before the heat dissipated and the bread stiffened. Children enjoyed the dish for its strong, salty flavour, while adults appreciated its convenience. During tea gatherings, sardine toast found its place beside cucumbers, pastries, and cold meats, though its scent often stood out among the more delicate offerings. Still, a few objected. The dish was too familiar, too woven into daily life to provoke surprise. Working-class families prepared sardine toast without ceremony. It served as a quick snack after long hours of labour, eaten while standing near the stove or sitting at a small table. The tin, once opened, was scraped clean to ensure nothing went to waste. For these households, the dish represented practicality. High in protein, inexpensive, and simple enough for anyone to prepare. The ease of opening a can meant that even homes with minimal cooking tools could enjoy a filling meal. The toast itself required little more than a fire and a piece of bread, making it one of the most accessible foods of the era. Yet the popularity of canned sardines also carried risks that few recognised. Preservation methods varied widely from one factory to another, and not all tins provided the same level of safety. Poor quality cans could corrode, allowing metal to seep into the oil. Storage conditions in shops were inconsistent, with tins often stacked near heat sources or exposed to moisture. These variables introduced invisible dangers until the can was opened, and even then, the strong natural smell of sardines sometimes masked early signs of spoilage. Families consumed the fish without hesitation, trusting the convenience of preserved foods in a world where trust was frequently misplaced. Despite such risks, sardine toast became a symbol of Victorian adaptability. Urban life required meals that were quick, inexpensive, and capable of sustaining long hours of work. Canned fish fit neatly into this requirement, offering nourishment that did not depend on unpredictable markets or daily shopping trips. Its presence during tea gatherings also reflected shifting social habits. As more women entered the workforce, the demand for simple, easily prepared foods increased. Sardine toast bridged the divide between time-consuming home cooking and the growing need for efficiency, allowing families to maintain traditional tea rituals without laborious preparation. The dish also mirrored the broader Victorian fascination with preserved goods. Canned foods felt modern, scientific, and trustworthy, even when their production remained inconsistent. People embraced them with optimism, seeing them as symbols of progress in a rapidly changing world. Sardine toast, with its combination of convenience and flavour, became a natural product of this era, a food that belonged equally to bustling cities and quiet villages. Its strong scent, hearty texture, and satisfying saltiness carved out a place in the daily routine that endured for decades. In understanding sardine toast, one sees how Victorian society balanced tradition with innovation. The dish carried the simplicity of bread and fish, but represented something far larger, the merging of industrial progress with everyday domestic life. It was a reminder that even the smallest foods can reflect the values, struggles, and aspirations of an entire era. Sardine toast shows how Victorians embraced preserved foods as signs of progress, welcoming their convenience despite the unpredictable quality hidden inside each tin. That same willingness to trust processed ingredients led to appetizer trays filled with battered animal brains, fried until crisp, and served as elegant delicacies in evening gatherings. Evening gatherings in Victorian society brought with them an air of formality, gentle conversation, and trays of food prepared to impress guests long before they tasted anything. Among the dishes carried into dining rooms lit by candlelight, brain fritters held a strangely elegant position. They appeared as small, crisp pieces arranged neatly on fine porcelain, their golden surfaces giving no hint of the raw material beneath. For many Victorians, consuming animal brains was neither shocking nor unusual. Offal remained an accepted part of the culinary landscape, valued for its richness and affordability. What distinguished brain fritters from other organ dishes was the illusion of refinement created through batter, heat, and presentation. The delicate crunch of the outer layer disguised the softness within, allowing diners to forget that they were eating the most fragile and intimate part of an animal. The preparation of these fritters began in kitchens where cooks worked briskly to clean the raw brains. Slaughterhouses supplied them cheaply, often sending them out still surrounded by thin membranes that required careful trimming. Cooks soaked the pieces in cold water to remove blood, then separated them with practiced fingers. The texture was delicate, almost slippery, and easily damaged if handled too roughly. Once prepared, the brains were cut into smaller portions and dipped into seasoned batter. Flour, eggs, pepper and herbs combined to create a coating that would crisp under the intense heat of frying. As the batter clung to the pieces, it offered both structure and disguise. Diners might have balked at the raw material, but few questioned it once the fritters emerged golden and steaming. Frying transformed the dish completely. Hot oil bubbled as the battered pieces were lowered into the pan, sealing the softness inside a crisp shell. The kitchen filled with a warm scent that blended frying fat with hints of spice. In well-staffed homes, servants worked quickly to deliver the fritters to waiting guests while they were still hot. In less refined settings, the oil might have been reused many times, its flavour deepening with each batch. Regardless of the conditions, the final presentation smoothed over the rough edges of preparation. Placed on trays beside polished cutlery and folded napkins, the fritters looked respectable, almost delicate. The atmosphere of a formal gathering made the act of consuming brains feel elegant rather than primitive. Victorians approached food with a practicality that modern diners sometimes misunderstand. Using every part of an animal was not merely economical, it was expected. Brains, with their creamy texture, were prized for fritters, pâtés, and other dishes meant to convey richness. Eating them carried no stigma, and in some circles, it even signalled a cultured palate. Guests accepted the fritters without hesitation, taking small bites as they conversed about politics, travel, or family matters. The smooth interior melted on the tongue, contrasting with the crisp exterior in a way that many found satisfying. Few paused to consider the origins of the ingredients, or the risks of preparing organ meats in kitchens where hygiene varied widely. Those risks were always present, though seldom acknowledged. Brains spoiled quickly, especially in warm kitchens or markets without proper cooling. Contaminated pieces might still look usable once battered, their flaws hidden beneath flour and egg. Frying could not eliminate every danger embedded in the tissue, yet illness was common enough in Victorian life that few connected symptoms to specific foods. When guests fell ill after a dinner party, they blamed exhaustion, cold weather, or general weakness, rather than the dishes they had enjoyed hours earlier. The fragility of the ingredient contrasted sharply with the confidence diners placed in the appearance of refinement. The cultural embrace of brain fritters also reflected a deeper Victorian fascination with transformation. Batter and heat could turn something considered unappealing into a delicacy fit for company. Presentation could elevate scraps into symbols of sophistication. This mindset pervaded many aspects of the era's cuisine, where illusion often mattered more than authenticity. Brain fritters fit neatly within this tradition, offering a meal that balanced decadence with thrift. They demonstrated the Victorian belief that elegance was achievable through technique rather than expensive ingredients. Understanding the dish requires understanding the social environment in which it flourished. Victorian gatherings emphasized appearances, not just in clothing and etiquette, but also in food. A well-arranged tray of fritters suggested a household that paid attention to detail, even if the ingredients spoke quietly of economic practicality. Diners who enjoyed the fritters participated in a subtle blend of indulgence and frugality, a balance that defined much of their culinary tradition. The dish carried the contradictions of the era, refinement built on humble foundations, pleasure shadowed by risk, and elegance constructed from the most unexpected materials. Brain fritters reveal how Victorians relied on culinary transformation to align modest ingredients with their expectations of sophistication. Behind the crisp exterior lay a reminder of the era's willingness to embrace foods that modern diners might hesitate to approach, all in the name of tradition and resourcefulness. Brain fritters show how Victorians masked fragility beneath crisp batter, trusting the illusion of refinement even when the ingredients carried hidden risks. In the same spirit of overlooking origins, a mashed anchovy paste spread across bread carried a sharp, briny force that defined another corner of their dining habits. Victorian kitchens often relied on ingredients that carried strong, unmistakable flavours, and anchovy paste became one of the staples that found its way into households across the social spectrum. It was a concentrated mixture made by crushing salted anchovies into a smooth, intensely briny paste, a product of both preservation practices and culinary preferences of the era. The Victorians valued foods that could heighten the taste of simple meals, and anchovy paste offered exactly that. Its deep saltiness and rich umami character allowed it to transform even the most modest dishes, making it a favoured addition not only in city homes, but also in rural households, where preserved fish remained a practical necessity. The paste created a bridge between practicality and indulgence, showing how Victorian cooks enhanced flavour without relying on expensive ingredients. The process of making anchovy paste began long before it reached Victorian kitchens. Anchovies were caught in large quantities, salted heavily, and allowed to cure in wooden barrels. Over time, the salt drew out moisture and concentrated the natural oils in the fish, resulting in a product that could endure long periods without spoiling. This method made anchovies reliable pantry goods, especially useful in a climate where fresh seafood could not always travel far inland. Once cured, the fish were mashed into a dense mixture, often combined with butter or spices to smooth the texture and enrich the taste. When sold commercially, the paste was packed into jars or tubes that made it easy to store and convenient for everyday cooking. In a period when refrigeration was limited or non-existent, such preserved foods became indispensable. Victorian households used anchovy paste in a variety of ways, each intended to amplify flavour. One of the most common uses was spreading it thinly over warm toast. The heat softened the paste, allowing its aroma to rise and mingle with the buttery surface of the bread. The result was a savoury bite that appealed to those who appreciated strong flavours, particularly during breakfast or afternoon meals. For others, the paste served as a base for sauces. Adding it to melted butter or gravy created a deeper, more complex taste that matched well with meats or vegetables. Even small amounts could have a significant impact, turning otherwise plain dishes into meals that felt hearty and satisfying. The paste's versatility ensured that it remained a pantry staple in many homes. Anchovy paste also reflected broader Victorian attitudes toward preserved foods. The era placed considerable trust in ingredients that could last through changing seasons, especially in households unaccustomed to frequent market trips. Preserved fish, salted meats, and bottled sauces were essential tools that allowed cooks to prepare meals efficiently. Anchovy paste fits seamlessly into this tradition, offering a long-lasting, concentrated source of flavour that requires little preparation. Victorians did not view such foods as lesser alternatives, but rather as reliable components of a well-stocked kitchen. For working families, the paste provided a quick way to elevate simple meals. For wealthier households, it became part of more elaborate dishes prepared by skilled cooks who appreciated its depth and intensity. Yet the flavour of anchovy paste was not universally loved. Its strong saltiness and pronounced fishiness could be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to it. Some people preferred only the faintest hint of anchovy in their meals, relying on the paste sparingly. Others embraced its boldness wholeheartedly, seeing it as a mark of refined taste. Culinary preferences varied widely, influenced by region, social class, and individual palate. Even so, the paste's presence in both humble kitchens and upper-class dining rooms demonstrated its broad appeal. It served as a reminder that Victorian food culture valued ingredients capable of shaping the identity of a dish with only a small amount. In many ways, anchovy paste represented Victorian ingenuity. It demonstrated how preserved foods could achieve complexity without requiring elaborate preparation. A simple jar held layers of flavour shaped by curing, crushing, and careful seasoning. The Victorians understood the power of concentrated ingredients and used them to compensate for the challenges of their environment. Harsh winters, limited access to fresh produce, and the demands of daily labour made shortcuts essential. Anchovy paste offered a solution that aligned with these needs, providing an instant burst of savouriness that could transform even the plainest ingredients. The enduring popularity of anchovy paste also illustrated the Victorian desire to blend convenience with culinary depth. It sat comfortably alongside pickles, preserved meats, and bottled condiments in pantries across the country. Its versatility gave it a lasting place in meal preparation, allowing cooks to experiment with textures and tastes without relying on costly spices or ingredients. Over time, the paste became more than just a seasoning. It became an expression of the Victorian approach to food, where practicality and flavour met in the middle. It embodied the belief that even preserved ingredients could contribute to meals that felt warm, satisfying, and thoughtfully prepared. Anchovy paste reveals how Victorians found richness in preserved foods, using concentrated flavours to strengthen meals shaped by limited resources. Its role in everyday cooking mirrored the era's dependence on ingredients that could endure, yet still offer depth and satisfaction. Anchovy paste reveals how Victorians depended on concentrated flavours to strengthen even the simplest meals, trusting preserved ingredients to bring depth where fresh foods were limited. From that reliance on strong, enduring tastes grew an openness to dishes shaped by distant cultures, including a warm bowl of rice mixed with smoked fish that became a familiar part of many morning tables. Victorian breakfast tables often reflected the complicated mix of domestic habits and imperial influence, and few dishes demonstrated this blend more clearly than kedgeree. It arrived in Britain through contact with India, where rice dishes seasoned with spices had long been part of local cuisine. Over time, British households adapted the idea into something familiar to their own tastes, replacing traditional spices with smoked fish, butter, and eggs. The result was a warm, comforting bowl of rice, mixed with flakes of smoked haddock, its aroma mild but steady, its texture soft enough to ease the household into the early hours of the day. For middle-class families, kedgeree offered a way to enjoy something that felt both hearty and refined, a dish that fit comfortably between practicality and indulgence without demanding complex preparation. The presence of kedgeree in Victorian homes reflected a broader pattern of culinary borrowing shaped by colonial expansion. British families who had lived in India brought the concept back with them, recalling the comfort of rice dishes eaten in warmer climates. As the British Empire grew, so did the flow of ingredients, recipes, and habits between regions. Kedgeree slowly found its place not only in grand houses, but also in more modest middle-class households, where cooks appreciated its ease and affordability. Smoked haddock was widely available, eggs were common, and rice had become cheaper due to increased importation. In this context, kedgeree felt like a sensible morning meal, offering substance without excess and warmth without heaviness. It occupied the space between tradition and novelty, shaped by distant lands, yet fully absorbed into local culture. Preparing kedgeree in a Victorian kitchen required a calm, steady rhythm that suited the early hours. Rice was boiled first, often rinsed repeatedly to remove starch and achieve a lighter texture. Smoked haddock was gently simmered until it softened enough to flake apart with a fork. The pieces were then folded into the rice, joining with small pats of butter that melted into the mixture. Hard-boiled eggs were sliced and added last, their soft whites and crumbly yolks bringing colour and richness. Some cooks seasoned the dish with parsley or pepper, while others kept it plain, preferring a mildness that aligned with British breakfast preferences. The result was a bowl that felt warm against the cold mornings that defined so much of Victorian domestic life. The appeal of kedgeree extended beyond its flavour. For many families, it represented a structured start to the day. Victorian households valued routine and order, especially in the morning when work, school, and household duties awaited. A dish that could be prepared reliably without excessive effort became part of that order. Kedgeree allowed cooks to make use of smoked haddock, a preserved fish that lasted well in pantries and could be kept on hand for several days. This was useful in an era when refrigeration was limited and fresh ingredients were not always guaranteed. The dish's predictable preparation made it a dependable element of breakfast menus, something that children, adults, and guests alike could expect to see on the table. Its presence also revealed how Victorian families navigated the shifting identity of British cuisine. The Empire brought new ideas, but incorporating them required adjustment. Kedgeree embodied this process. It took a dish rooted in Indian culinary traditions and reshaped it to fit British tastes, removing strong spices and replacing them with ingredients common in local kitchens. What remained was a dish that carried faint echoes of its origins, yet felt undeniably Victorian. Its adoption into middle-class households demonstrated how cultural influences could be softened, filtered, and reassembled into something familiar. Through kedgeree, British breakfasts gained a quiet link to distant territories, a connection that lived in the rhythm of morning routines rather than deliberate cultural exchange. For servants working in Victorian households, kedgeree offered both convenience and challenge. Its ingredients were simple enough to prepare, but timing mattered. The dish needed to be warm when served, and kitchens often prepared multiple items simultaneously. While eggs boiled and rice simmered, pans of bacon, toast, or porridge might also be underway, requiring constant movement and attention. Kedgeree's reliance on preserved fish made it manageable even during colder months, when market trips were less frequent. It served as a practical reminder of how Victorian kitchens balanced limited resources with the demand for steady, satisfying meals. For the families who ate it, kedgeree carried subtle signals of status. It was strongly associated with the middle class, suggesting a household that kept up with contemporary food trends without venturing into the extravagance of upper-class banquets. It reflected literacy and the culinary influences of the empire, yet it remained grounded in simple comfort. Eating kedgeree meant partaking in a dish shaped by travel, adaptation, and domestic ritual. It was neither exotic nor plain, neither luxurious nor austere. It existed gently in between, providing warmth, nourishment, and a quiet start to the day. Kedgeree illustrates how Victorian households absorbed ideas from abroad, transforming them into dishes that aligned with local tastes and morning routines. The bowl of rice, fish, and eggs offered both familiarity and quiet novelty, revealing how the empire shaped even the simplest domestic meals. Kedgeree shows how Victorians softened foreign dishes into gentle morning foods, blending smoked fish with rice to create something warm and modest for the breakfast table. Building on this comfort, another dessert from the era took shape in kitchens where milk and gelatin were transformed into a moulded sweetness served at evening gatherings. Evening meals in 19th century Britain often ended with desserts that were gentle in flavour and carefully presented, and blancmange became one of the most recognisable dishes to fill that role. It appeared on tables as a pale, moulded shape that trembled lightly with each movement, its surface smooth and slightly glossy under candlelight. Hosts appreciated how this dessert created a sense of refinement without requiring rare or extravagant ingredients. Milk, gelatin, and sugar formed its foundation, and with the help of decorative moulds, these simple components transformed into something that looked elegant enough for formal gatherings. For households that valued modesty and quiet beauty in their meals, blancmange suited the tone perfectly, providing a soft conclusion to evenings filled with multiple savoury courses. The process of making blancmange reflected a preference for careful technique over luxurious materials. Cooks began by heating milk slowly, ensuring it thickened gently instead of burning at the bottom of the pan. Gelatin dissolved into the warm liquid, binding the mixture and giving it the ability to hold its shape later. A small amount of sugar added mild sweetness, never enough to overwhelm the palate. Some versions included almond flavouring or vanilla, but many households kept the dessert extremely simple. Once the mixture achieved the right level of smoothness, it was poured into decorative moulds. These moulds often reproduced shapes inspired by flowers, towers, or geometric ridges, making the finished blancmange look more elaborate than its ingredients suggested. Cooling the moulds required patience and attention. In well-equipped homes, servants placed them in pantry cupboards or near cold windows where temperatures remained low. When winter arrived, the natural chill of the air made the setting process easier, giving the dessert a firm yet tender structure. In warmer months, cooks had to watch the moulds more carefully, adjusting their placement to help the mixture solidify without melting around the edges. Hours later, once fully set, the blancmange needed to be unmoulded. This moment determined whether the dessert would appear elegant or flawed. A smooth release from the mould produced clean lines and delicate curves. A failed release could leave cracks or collapsed sections that compromised the presentation. What made blancmange endure in households across different income levels was its combination of accessibility and decorative potential. Milk and gelatin were not costly, and the moulds could be reused endlessly. Families seeking to impress guests found that a well-shaped blancmange delivered visual appeal without demanding expensive fruits, spices, or imported goods. The dessert aligned with a broader cultural emphasis on moderation, where elegance was achieved through restraint rather than extravagance. Its mild taste matched the preference for foods that were easy to digest, especially after a long dinner filled with hearty dishes. Even diners with delicate stomachs found blancmange agreeable, which added to its popularity at evening gatherings. Beyond its place at dinner tables, blancmange often appeared in contexts linked to health and convalescence. Doctors recommended soft, easily digestible foods for patients recovering from illness, and this dessert fit naturally into that category. Its smooth texture required little chewing, and its mild flavour avoided overwhelming the senses of anyone who felt weak. Many families prepared blancmange specifically for relatives who needed nourishment without heaviness. In these moments, the dessert served as both food and comfort, carrying a sense of care that extended beyond taste alone. The presence of blancmange in dining rooms also reflected the rhythm of labour within 19th century households. Preparing it demanded foresight, since the dessert had to be made hours before it was served. Cooks planned their schedules accordingly, juggling meats that needed roasting, vegetables that required chopping, and sauces that simmered on the stove. Amid all these tasks, creating a smooth, perfectly set blancmange demonstrated the discipline and skill of the kitchen staff. Many servants took pride in presenting a flawless dessert, knowing the household's reputation often rested on the quality and appearance of meals served to guests. Even though its ingredients were modest, blancmange carried symbolic weight. It represented a belief that beauty could emerge from simplicity and that refinement did not require luxury. The dessert's pale colour and soft texture embodied gentleness, making it a fitting choice for evening meals designed to end the day on a calm note. Its understated nature contrasted with richer desserts that became more fashionable later, such as layered cakes, chocolate puddings, and fruit-based tarts. As culinary tastes changed, blancmange gradually appeared less often, but its association with 19th century dining customs endured. The dessert's decline did not erase its historical significance. Blancmange remains a clear example of how meals once balanced practicality, aesthetics, and social expectation. It continues to illustrate a period when households valued visually pleasing foods without being indulgent, and when presentation mattered as much as flavour. By understanding why this dessert held such a prominent place on evening tables, one can better appreciate the cultural landscape that shaped daily life during those years. Blancmange reveals how households of the era achieved a sense of refinement through gentle textures, modest flavours, and careful presentation, using simple ingredients to craft something that looked far more elaborate than it truly was. Blancmange demonstrates how elegance grew from restraint, allowing diners to end meals with a quiet sweetness, shaped more by texture than taste. As kitchens turned from soft moulded desserts to denser creations, cooks often reached for suet and cloth, preparing heavy steamed puddings that offered a very different experience of sweetness. Among the desserts that shaped evening meals in 19th century households, suet pudding carried a presence very different from the gentle softness of blancmange. This dish was dense, warm, and heavy, made from a mixture of flour and finely chopped suet that created a substantial texture once cooked. It looked less delicate than moulded desserts, yet it held a firm place in kitchens across the country. Suet, the hard fat found around the kidneys of cattle, served as a dependable ingredient that blended well with flour to form a pudding batter capable of withstanding long steaming times. Wrapped in cloth and suspended over boiling water, the batter slowly transformed into a solid, comforting pudding that could be sliced and served in generous pieces. For many households, this dessert represented the practical side of cooking, where warmth, sturdiness, and reliable ingredients mattered as much as presentation. Preparing suet pudding required deliberate steps that reflected the rhythm of daily cooking in homes with limited resources. Suet needed to be chopped finely, often by kitchen servants who used sharp knives to break the fat into small pieces. These pieces were then combined with flour, sugar, and occasionally dried fruits or spices, depending on what the household could afford. The mixture was moistened with milk or water until it formed a thick batter. Once ready, it was spooned into a cloth bag, tied securely, and placed into a pot of boiling water. Steam and heat slowly penetrated the batter, causing it to swell and firm up over time. The process took patience, and cooks often turned their attention to other dishes while the pudding continued to steam for hours. The resulting dessert reflected the values of practicality and thrift that shaped many 19th century meals. Suet was inexpensive and widely available, making it a staple ingredient in kitchens that needed to stretch supplies. It formed the foundation of various savoury and sweet dishes, but puddings remained the most popular use. These puddings provided a sense of fullness, especially during colder seasons when families sought foods that felt warming and substantial. The dense texture and lingering warmth of suet pudding suited winter evenings particularly well, offering a satisfying contrast to the chill outside. Even households with modest means could prepare it, turning basic pantry staples into a dessert that felt comforting and complete. While suet pudding lacked the decorative elegance of moulded desserts, it still appeared in dining settings that valued tradition. Families served it with simple accompaniments such as syrup, custard, or butter, allowing diners to adjust the sweetness to their liking. In some homes, suet pudding appeared as a festive dish during holidays, enriched with dried fruits and spices to create more elaborate versions. For most families, however, the pudding remained ordinary and familiar, part of a weekly rotation that reflected steady domestic habits rather than special occasions. Its predictability offered reassurance, especially in times when ingredients needed to last through long seasons. The steaming method used for suet pudding also represented an important aspect of historical cooking. Many households lacked ovens capable of maintaining steady temperatures, making steaming a reliable technique for preparing foods that needed even heat. Cloth bags served as makeshift containers, allowing moisture to circulate the batter while keeping it contained. This method ensured that households without advanced kitchen equipment could still produce consistent results. The practical nature of steaming made suet pudding one of the most accessible desserts of the time, sustained by tradition as much as necessity. Suet pudding reveals how families balanced their desire for comfort with the economic constraints of daily life. The dish did not rely on luxury, but instead turned simple ingredients into something warming and filling. It fit naturally into environments where meals needed to be satisfying without extravagance. The dessert also reflected the labour behind household cooking. Preparing suet required effort, and steaming a pudding demanded attention throughout the day. For servants or family members responsible for meals, producing a well-cooked pudding demonstrated both skill and reliability. Despite its simplicity, suet pudding carried emotional weight in many homes. It evoked memories of shared meals, seasonal changes, and traditions passed from one generation to the next. Children often grew up eating versions of the pudding that varied slightly from household to household, shaped by the resources available and the preferences of the cook. Its presence on the table signalled stability, especially during times when the world outside felt unpredictable. In this way, suet pudding became more than a dessert. It served as a culinary anchor, linking everyday routines with deeper cultural patterns in food preparation. As culinary trends evolved, lighter and more visually appealing desserts gradually replaced suet pudding on many tables. New baking technologies introduced cakes and pastries that felt more modern, while changing tastes favoured recipes with brighter flavours and smoother textures. Nevertheless, the historical role of suet pudding remains a window into a period when meals were shaped by practicality, limited equipment, and seasonal pressures. The dessert stands as a reminder of how households found comfort through dishes that prioritised warmth and nourishment over elegance. Suet pudding highlights the era's reliance on heavy, warming desserts that satisfied families through long seasons, using simple ingredients to produce something enduring and filling. Its method of preparation and its comforting weight reveal a kitchen tradition shaped by limited resources, patient labour, and a preference for foods that offered deep, steady warmth at the end of a meal. Suet pudding demonstrates how cooks turned flour and fat into dense, sustaining sweetness through long, steaming hours, building comfort from modest ingredients. From this heavier style of dessert, kitchens also produced delicate pastries filled with oysters, creating savoury bites that captured a very different side of evening dining. In the 19th century, oysters occupied a place in daily meals that can feel surprising today, appearing not as luxury items but as ingredients accessible to households of many income levels. Oyster patties, small pastries filled with seasoned oyster mixtures, became a common feature at social gatherings, where hosts aimed to present dishes that balanced elegance with affordability. The patties offered a delicate contrast between crisp pastry shells and the soft, savoury filling inside. They were served warm, often arranged neatly on trays carried through drawing rooms where guests conversed in low voices. In these settings, oyster patties felt perfectly suited to the atmosphere, offering small, refined bites that reflected both practicality and the social expectations of the time. Preparing oyster patties required a combination of fresh ingredients and careful timing. Bakers began by rolling out pastry dough and cutting it into small rounds. These rounds were shaped into shallow shells, baked until firm enough to hold their filling without collapsing. While the shells cooled, cooks turned to the oysters themselves. Shucked oysters were chopped into pieces and simmered briefly in a mixture of butter, cream, and mild seasonings. The goal was to create a creamy filling that preserved the oyster's natural brininess without overwhelming it. Once the mixture thickened, it was spooned into the pastry shells. Some households garnished the patties with herbs or pepper, while others preferred to let the simple flavour of the oysters stand on its own. Oysters held a surprisingly steady place in the diets of 19th century families. The waters surrounding Britain provided abundant supplies, and inexpensive transportation allowed them to be sold widely in markets. Vendors carried them through city streets, offering oysters at prices far lower than many other sources of protein. As a result, oysters appeared in hearty stews, simple suppers, and elaborate party dishes alike. For households planning evening receptions, oyster patties offered a way to elevate a common ingredient into something more refined. The contrast between humble origins and polished presentation captured the practical creativity of domestic cooking during this period. The patties also aligned with the social rituals of Victorian gatherings. Events often featured multiple courses or trays of small dishes passed around to guests while they mingled. Foods needed to be easy to eat while standing or conversing, and oyster patties fulfilled this need neatly. Their pastry shells kept their hands clean, and their size allowed guests to enjoy them in a single or double bite. Hosts appreciated how the patties fit seamlessly into the flow of conversation, offering nourishment without interrupting the rhythm of social interaction. The dish became part of a larger landscape of small, savoury bites that filled parlours, dining rooms, and event halls. The appeal of oyster patties extended beyond their convenience. They represented a moment in culinary history when seafood, particularly oysters, remained accessible to ordinary people. This abundance shaped the palates of families who grew accustomed to foods now considered luxurious. The filling inside the patties captured the flavour of the sea in a mild, creamy form that suited the tastes of diners unused to strong spices. The pastry added a sense of structure and refinement, turning a simple oyster mixture into a delicacy that looked more elaborate than it truly was. Through this transformation, oyster patties demonstrated how presentation could shift perceptions of even the simplest ingredients. In many homes, kitchen staff played an important role in ensuring the patties appeared at their best. Timing mattered greatly. If the shells were filled too early, they risked becoming soggy before guests arrived. If the filling cooled too much, it lost its luxurious texture. Servants often worked in steady, coordinated patterns, baking shells in batches and keeping fillings warm without allowing them to thicken beyond use. The creation of these patties reflected the larger demands placed on kitchen staff, who were expected to produce numerous dishes simultaneously while maintaining quality and speed. Though oyster patties became staples at gatherings, they also appeared on ordinary dinner tables. Families prepared them for weekends, celebrations, or moments when they wanted to bring something special to a meal without committing to complex recipes. Children and adults alike enjoyed the warm, creamy centre nestled inside crisp pastry. In working-class homes, simpler versions of the patties emerged, sometimes using minimal seasoning or more robust pastry shells to stretch ingredients further. Yet the essence of the dish remained the same, showing how certain foods transcended social class by adapting to available resources. Over time, changes in the availability of oysters shaped the patties' decline. Overfishing and environmental shifts caused oyster populations to dwindle, raising prices and limiting access. As oysters became associated with luxury rather than everyday meals, dishes like oyster patties gradually faded from ordinary households. They persisted in some formal menus, but lost the widespread presence they once held. Their disappearance underscores how shifting resources and economic forces can alter culinary traditions, leaving behind foods that now feel distant or unfamiliar. Oyster patties reveal a period when simple ingredients could be transformed into refined dishes through skillful preparation and thoughtful presentation. They reflect a moment when oysters were abundant and affordable, shaping both everyday meals and social gatherings. Their place in history highlights the fluid nature of culinary value, where ingredients move between ordinary and exceptional, depending on the circumstances of the time. Oyster patties illustrate how families once turned inexpensive shellfish into elegant pastries that carried both comfort and refinement. As tastes shifted and resources changed, lighter dishes began to take their place, including thin slices of chilled beef tongue served neatly on plates during midday meals. Meals in 19th century households often relied on dishes that could be prepared ahead of time, stored safely, and served without reheating, and cold tongue fit naturally into this rhythm of domestic life. The dish began with a whole beef tongue, simmered for hours until it softened enough to slice with ease. Once cooked, it was removed from the broth, peeled, pressed, and left to cool completely. As it settled, the tongue firmed into a smooth, dense shape that held together neatly when cut. Families appreciated its practicality, especially for midday meals when there was little time to prepare something complex. Thin slices arranged on a plate created a dish that felt orderly and substantial, offering a savoury option that required no last-minute effort. Preparing cold tongue reflected the everyday realities of 19th century kitchens, where fuel, time, and labour had to be used carefully. Simmering a beef tongue demanded hours at the stove, but the slow cooking could continue while other tasks took place. Servants stirred soups, scrubbed pans, or tended fires as the pot bubbled gently, its surface gathering foam that needed occasional skimming. The tongue itself required attention only at key moments. Once tender enough, it was pulled from the hot water and placed onto a work table, where the outer skin was carefully removed. The underlying meat revealed a smooth surface that would later slice with clean precision. Pressing the tongue as it cooled helped improve its texture, ensuring the slices lay flat and uniform. Cold tongue gained popularity because it adapted well to the structure of midday meals, especially in homes where dining needed to be efficient. Lunch was rarely a leisurely event. Workers, school children, and household members needed something filling but not heavy, something that could be prepared earlier in the day or even the night before. When sliced thinly, cold tongue offered a gentle, savoury flavour without overwhelming richness. Its density allowed slices to hold their shape on plates or in small sandwiches, making it a flexible option for families who needed practical foods that travelled well or stored easily. The mild flavour of cold tongue pairs naturally with simple accompaniments found in many homes. Mustard, pickles, horseradish, or sharp relishes added brightness, cutting through the richness of the meat. Fresh bread or boiled potatoes completed the meal, depending on what was available. For families with access to gardens or local markets, cold tongue might be served alongside crisp vegetables during warmer months. In winter, it appeared beside preserved or pickled foods that brought sharper notes to the table. Its role was less about making a dramatic impression and more about providing steady nourishment. This dish also reflected the era's approach to using every part of an animal. Beef tongue, though not considered a prime cut, offered a source of meat that could be acquired at a lower cost than steaks or roasts. Families sought ways to prepare these modest cuts so they felt respectable and satisfying. Slow boiling and careful slicing achieved this transformation, turning a tough, raw tongue into something tender and visually appealing. Cold tongue thus aligned with the philosophy of thrift that shaped much of 19th century cooking, where skill and patience allowed cooks to elevate inexpensive ingredients into respectable meals. In wealthier households, cold tongue appeared on luncheon spreads arranged neatly on long tables. Servants placed the slices in symmetrical patterns, often overlooking the simplicity of the ingredient itself. Silver platters, garnishes of parsley or thinly sliced lemons, and crisp linens created an atmosphere of refinement, even for dishes rooted in practicality. Guests helped themselves between conversations, enjoying the convenience of foods that required no carving or reheating. In more modest homes, presentation was simpler, yet the dish remained a dependable source of protein that families welcomed throughout the year. The dish's longevity also stemmed from its durability. Once cooked and cooled, cold tongue could be stored for days if kept in a cool pantry or cellar. This made it valuable during seasons when refrigeration options were limited. Families could cook a tongue early in the week and rely on it for several meals, slicing only what they needed. Its texture held up well over time, unlike some meats that dried or toughened quickly. For busy households balancing farm work, employment, or domestic labour, this dependability mattered greatly. Even though beef tongue was once commonplace, the rise of modern refrigeration, changes in meat preferences, and the growing availability of more convenient lunch foods eventually pushed cold tongue out of everyday use. Its preparation required time and patience that fewer households were willing to invest, as commercial foods became more accessible. Yet the dish remains a reflection of a period when flavour was shaped not only by taste, but by practicality, resourcefulness, and the rhythms of daily work. Cold tongue persists in culinary history as a reminder of these habits, revealing how families once balanced nourishment, preservation, and efficiency in their meals. Cold tongue shows how households transformed a humble cut of meat into a reliable midday dish, using slow cooking and careful slicing to create something both practical and satisfying. Its presence on lunch tables captured the values of thrift and steadiness that shaped food traditions across the era. Cold tongue illustrates how even simple cuts found a place in everyday meals when prepared with patience and purpose, creating steady nourishment for households large and small. Building on this idea of ingredients shaped by seasonal customs, another dish emerged from hunting culture, where pastry crusts were filled with meat from the countryside to form hearty pies served in cooler months. Seasonal traditions shaped many dishes in 19th century households, and game pies stood out as one of the clearest expressions of how food intertwined with the rhythms of the countryside. The dish appeared most often during hunting seasons, when deer, pheasant, hare, and other wild animals became available through organised hunts led by wealthy landowners. Thick pastry crusts enclosed richly seasoned meat, allowing the pie to retain moisture during long baking hours. When brought to the table, the pie carried the deep aroma of the forest, signalling a connection between domestic kitchens and the landscapes where the animals had been hunted. For the upper classes, serving game pie became a way to showcase both abundance and tradition, a reminder of privileges tied to land ownership and access to hunting grounds. Preparing game pie required a long sequence of steps that highlighted the division of labour within well-staffed households. After a hunting excursion, the carcasses were brought back to the estate, where servants cleaned, skinned, and prepared the meat. This process demanded skill, as game meats often differed in texture and required specialised methods of trimming. Once prepared, the meat was marinated with herbs, vinegar, or wine to soften its stronger flavours. Thick cuts of venison or hare, mixed with smaller pieces of pheasant or partridge, created a layered filling that varied with each season. The pastry crust, made from sturdy dough enriched with lard or butter, needed to be firm enough to hold the weight of the filling while remaining tender after baking. Cooks shaped the crust carefully, creating deep pies that could stand on their own without collapsing. Game pie appeared most frequently during special occasions, especially winter gatherings, when households sought hearty foods capable of feeding large groups. The dish's substantial nature made it suitable for festive meals where guests gathered around long tables filled with roasted vegetables, spiced beverages, and other seasonal offerings. Each slice of the pie revealed dense layers of meat, juices absorbed into the crust, and a balance of flavours that reflected hours of preparation. The richness of the dish satisfied diners seeking warmth and nourishment during colder months. Even though the pie relied on wild ingredients, it carried an air of refinement due to the skill required to prepare it. The cultural significance of game pie extended beyond taste. It reflected a social structure in which hunting functioned not only as sport, but also as an expression of privilege. Landowners controlled vast estates where hunting seasons were organised with precision. Guests invited to these events engaged in a ritual that reinforced social bonds and hierarchy. Preparing a game pie became part of this ritual, transforming the results of the hunt into a dish that symbolised both hospitality and status. Serving such a pie communicated to guests that the household participated fully in the traditions of the elite, offering food that tied them to the rhythms of the land under their control. In more modest households, game pie appeared less frequently but still carried meaning. Families with access to small plots of land or connections to local hunters used whatever game they could acquire to create their own versions of the dish. These pies tended to be simpler, relying on fewer spices and less elaborate crusts. Nevertheless, they provided a rare opportunity to enjoy meats that were otherwise expensive or difficult to obtain. For rural families, making game pie connected domestic life to seasonal cycles in ways similar to wealthier households, though without the grandeur associated with estate hunting traditions. The dish served as a reminder that food drew people into patterns shaped by landscape, labour, and tradition. The longevity of game pie also reflected practical concerns. Its dense structure allowed it to be stored for several days if kept in a cool pantry. Thick crusts protected the meat from drying out, and the spices used in the filling helped preserve flavour. For families facing long winters or limited access to fresh ingredients, this resilience mattered. A large pie could feed many people over the course of several meals, stretching resources in a way that suited households accustomed to planning. This practicality made game pie not only a festive dish, but also a strategic one. The sensory experience of eating game pie carried layers of meaning as well. The darker meats brought earthy notes, while the pastry crust offered contrast through its buttery firmness. When served at gatherings, the aroma filled dining rooms, bringing with it a sense of the outdoors. Diners encountered the flavours of forests, fields, and hillsides, even while seated inside warm homes. This connection between wild landscapes and domestic comfort defined much of the dish's appeal. It stood as a bridge between the ruggedness of the hunt and the refinement of the table. Although changes in hunting practices, food availability, and household structures eventually reduced the presence of game pie in everyday meals, it remains a powerful reminder of how culinary traditions emerge from the interplay between environment and culture. The dish reflects a period when food carried clear signals about status, resources, and seasonal rhythms. Its preparation and consumption reveal the values that shape domestic life and the traditions that guided communities through the year. Game pie shows how households once wove hunting culture into their meals, using richly seasoned wild meats enclosed in sturdy pastry to create dishes tied closely to land and season. Its presence on special occasions revealed the connection between privilege, landscape, and the traditions that shaped the culinary identity of the era. Game pie demonstrates how the flavours of the countryside were carried into dining rooms through hearty pastry crusts and richly seasoned meats, linking domestic meals to seasonal hunts. As households shifted toward lighter dishes for warmer days, cooks began preparing vegetables and leafy greens differently, creating salads that contrasted sharply with the weight of winter pies. Cookbooks from the 19th century often contained recipes that reflected a willingness to experiment with ingredients in ways that can feel unexpected today, and fish custard stood as one of the clearest examples of this adventurous approach. The dish combined flaked fish with a mixture of eggs and milk, blending savoury and delicate components into a baked custard that set firmly in a mould. At the table, it appeared as a pale, smooth form that seemed more like a dessert than a savoury dish, until its aroma revealed the presence of fish beneath the surface. Households that prepared fish custard embraced a style of cooking that favoured quiet invention, relying on familiar ingredients but arranging them in unfamiliar ways. In an era when cookbooks guided domestic life with detailed instructions, this dish represented the kitchen's continual search for new textures and gentle flavours. The preparation of fish custard began with choosing the fish itself. Cooks selected white fish that flaked easily, such as haddock or cod, avoiding varieties with overpowering flavours. The fish was poached gently until just tender, then broken apart into small pieces that would distribute evenly through the custard mixture. Meanwhile, eggs and milk were whisked together, creating a base similar to the foundation of sweet custards served at the end of meals. Seasonings remained mild, often limited to salt, pepper, or a hint of nutmeg. The goal was not to create sharp contrasts, but to blend the ingredients into a unified texture that felt calm and smooth. Once the mixture was combined, it was poured into moulds similar to those used for blancmange or baked puddings. These moulds gave the finished custard its shape, allowing it to stand neatly on a plate after baking. Cooks placed the moulds in shallow pans filled with water, creating a bain-marie that protected the custard from direct heat. Slow, steady baking ensured that the eggs set without curdling, and that the fish remained tender rather than dry. The surface of the custard often remained pale, with only slight browning at the edges. After cooling briefly, the dish was unmoulded and carried to the dining room, where its shape and smoothness became part of its appeal. Fish custard reflected a broader pattern of experimentation found in 19th century kitchens. Households enjoyed testing recipes that pushed the boundaries of familiar combinations, especially when such dishes appeared in respected cookbooks. These books served as guides not only for cooking techniques, but also for cultural expectations surrounding meals. A recipe printed in a well-known volume signaled that the dish had achieved a degree of acceptance, even if its concept seemed unusual. Fish custard belonged to a category of foods that merged savoury and sweet elements, creating textures more commonly associated with desserts. This blending of categories aligned with a period when culinary creativity sought new ways to use everyday ingredients. In practical terms, fish custard offered an economical way to create a dish that felt refined while relying on ingredients already present in most homes. Fish was a common protein, especially in coastal regions or cities with steady access to markets. Eggs and milk were staples in many households, making the custard base easy to assemble. For families needing to stretch their supplies or present meals that felt more formal than their budgets allowed, the dish provided a solution. Its moulded shape lent it an air of sophistication that belied the modest ingredients used to make it. Serving fish custard at a luncheon or evening meal signalled resourcefulness and confidence in the kitchen's abilities. The mildness of the dish suited the era's taste preferences. Harsh spices or heavy sauces rarely appeared in everyday meals. Instead, households leaned toward gentle flavours that allowed natural ingredients to stand on their own. Fish custard aligned with this philosophy, presenting a unified texture that encouraged slow, steady eating. Its smoothness appealed to diners who preferred dishes that felt comforting rather than intense. Children and older family members often found it easier to eat than firmer fish dishes, making it a versatile option for households with diverse needs. Yet the dish's unusual profile also revealed the shifting boundaries of taste during the 19th century. Recipes that blended categories, such as savoury custards, meat jellies, or sweet puddings with vegetable bases, illustrated a culinary landscape driven by curiosity and practical necessity. Fish custard, with its unexpected combination of ingredients, offered a way to participate in these trends while still relying on accessible supplies. Cookbooks encouraged such experimentation, providing detailed instructions that allowed even inexperienced cooks to attempt dishes they might not have imagined on their own. As decades passed, changing tastes and advancements in culinary technology pushed dishes like fish custard out of everyday circulation. Ovens improved, refrigeration expanded ingredient availability, and new recipes replaced older ones that favoured mildness and dense textures. Fish custard gradually became a reminder of a period when ingenuity shaped meals as much as resources did. Its presence in historical cookbooks highlights how households once approached food with a combination of practicality and creative willingness, forming dishes that now seem unfamiliar, but once represented thoughtful domestic effort. Fish custard shows how households embraced gentle experimentation, using familiar ingredients to create moulded dishes that blended savoury and soft textures into a single, steady form. It reveals a kitchen tradition shaped by practicality, curiosity, and a desire to make ordinary foods feel refined through careful preparation. Fish custard illustrates how domestic cooks once embraced unusual combinations, transforming fish and custard into a single moulded dish shaped by quiet experimentation. As kitchens moved beyond such blends, attention returned to simpler cuts like tripe, prepared in ways that reflected the era's reliance on every part of the animal. Households in the 19th century relied heavily on ingredients that made full use of every part of an animal, and tripe stood at the centre of this resourceful approach to daily cooking. Tripe, the cleaned stomach lining of cattle, offered a steady source of nourishment for families who needed affordable proteins and practical ingredients that could stretch across multiple meals. Its presence on the table reflected a culinary culture shaped by thrift, patience, and a willingness to transform even the toughest cuts into dishes that felt warm and sustaining. Though its texture and appearance differed from more familiar meats, tripe became a common ingredient in soups, stews, and boiled dishes served throughout the week, fitting naturally into the routines of households that valued economy and consistency in their meals. Preparing tripe required significant effort long before it reached the stove. Raw tripe needed to be scrubbed thoroughly to remove impurities, then soaked and washed repeatedly. These early steps demanded strong hands and careful attention, often carried out by servants or family members accustomed to the labour of maintaining a household kitchen. Once washed, the tripe was boiled slowly to soften its naturally firm texture. This initial cooking could take several hours, filling the kitchen with steady heat as the pot simmered. Only after this lengthy preparation did the tripe become ready for use in actual dishes, where it might be sliced into strips or cut into squares before being added to broths or stews. Tripe's popularity stemmed from its affordability and its ability to absorb flavors from surrounding ingredients. A pot of tripe stew could make use of vegetables, herbs, and seasonings already present in the pantry, creating a dish that fills the stomach without requiring expensive cuts of meat. Families often combine tripe with onions, carrots, or potatoes, letting the ingredients simmer until their flavors melded into a single, modest but comforting whole. In urban areas, tripe shops sold pre-cleaned portions to customers seeking quick dinner solutions. In rural homes, tripe preparation became part of the broader work of butchering animals during seasonal slaughtering, ensuring that nothing went to waste. The texture of tripe shaped both its appeal and its limitations. It had a slight chewiness that softened during long cooking sessions, absorbing broth and seasoning while retaining a delicate firmness. This texture made it suitable for soups that simmered throughout the day, adding substance to meals that needed to serve large families or labourers returning from work. Its appearance, though unfamiliar to some, carried no stigma during its widespread use. Instead, tripe symbolised a practical approach to cooking, where nutrition and resourcefulness were more important than refinement. In many working-class homes, tripe served as a dependable ingredient that appeared frequently at the table. It provided protein at a cost far lower than beef or mutton, allowing families to stretch their budgets without sacrificing nourishment. Street vendors recognized their popularity and sold bowls of steaming tripe stew to workers who needed warm meals quickly. These dishes became part of the everyday experience in industrial cities, where the aroma of simmering tripe blended with the sounds of factory life. Families living in crowded neighborhoods often shared similar meals, creating a sense of unity born from common cooking practices. Tripe also carried cultural associations tied to seasonal traditions. During times of butchering, households used every part of the animal, turning scraps and organs into dishes that could last through colder months. Tripe fits naturally into these traditions, providing a means of extending valuable resources. Recipes passed down through generations reflected this mindset, with variations shaped by region, availability, and personal preference. Some families preferred tripe boiled in milk to soften its texture further, while others favoured spicy or acidic broths to give the dish greater vibrancy. Whatever the method, tripe remained a reliable staple. Even in households with more resources, tripe appeared as part of culinary curiosities or traditional menus. Cookbooks included recipes for preparing it with more elaborate seasonings or combining it with richer sauces. These versions demonstrated how foods associated with thrift could still find their place in diverse kitchens. The dish's flexibility made it a constant presence, appearing in both humble bowls and more carefully arranged presentations, depending on the home preparing it. The labour required to prepare tripe also highlighted the routines that shaped domestic work. Kitchens needed time, fuel, and patience to transform raw tripe into something edible. This effort underscored the value placed on foods that rewarded discipline, where the process of cooking became as significant as the final dish. For many families, the steady process of cleaning, boiling, and simmering tripe represented the broader rhythm of daily life, where tasks were approached with persistence and care. As culinary tastes shifted and new ingredients became more accessible, the presence of tripe in everyday meals declined. Advances in refrigeration and transportation made other cuts of meat more affordable, reducing the need to rely on organ meats as frequently. Modern preferences moved toward foods with smoother textures and simpler preparation methods. Yet the historical role of tripe remains important, offering insight into how households balanced limited resources with the demands of nourishment. Tripe shows how households embraced resourceful cooking practices, transforming a humble part of the animal into meals that offered warmth, structure, and steady nourishment. Its presence in daily life reflects an era shaped by practicality, patience, and an unwavering commitment to using every available ingredient. Tripe illustrates how families once relied on patient preparation to turn tough cuts into dependable meals, creating dishes rooted in thrift and steady labour. From this emphasis on preservation and resourcefulness, another food emerged that transformed unripe walnuts into a sharply flavoured accompaniment prized in homes across the country. Households in the 19th century often relied on preserved foods to add sharp, lively flavours to meals built around heavier ingredients, and pickled walnuts became one of the most striking examples of this tradition. These walnuts, harvested while still young and soft enough to be pierced with a needle, were soaked in brine, soaked again in vinegar, and left to darken into a deep, almost black colour. Their transformation from pale green fruit to richly flavoured preserves made them a familiar presence in kitchens that valued both practicality and variety. Served alongside roasted meats, pickled walnuts offered a bright, acidic contrast that cut through the richness of main dishes, balancing flavours in ways that reflected the thoughtful structure of meals during the period. The preparation of pickled walnuts began early in the summer, when the fruits were soft enough to be easily pierced, and before the shells had hardened. Harvesting them at the correct moment required attention to seasonal cues, as walnuts collected even slightly too late could develop tough shells that resisted brining. Once gathered, the walnuts were pricked or sliced to encourage the absorption of brine. They were then soaked in salted water for several days, a step that softened bitterness and began the process of preservation. During this time, the walnuts gradually darkened, their interiors changing texture as the brine penetrated the flesh. After the brining stage, the walnuts were drained and left exposed to air, allowing them to turn a deep brown or near black shade. The final step involved submerging them in vinegar infused with spices such as cloves, peppercorns, or bay leaves. This vinegar mixture steeped into the walnuts over weeks or even months, creating a flavour that was at once sour, earthy, and slightly aromatic. Households stored the jars in cool pantries where the pickles continued to mature, often improving in complexity over time. By late autumn or winter, when fresh produce was scarce and meals grew heavier, these pickled walnuts became valuable accompaniments that brightened plates dominated by meats and root vegetables. Pickled walnuts held a special place at the table because they supported the kind of balanced eating that defined many 19th century meals. Roasted meats, especially beef or mutton, formed the centerpieces of family dinners. Their richness required something sharp to cut through the weight, and the acidity of pickled walnuts accomplished this effectively. A few slices placed beside the meat added contrast not only in flavour, but also in texture. Their soft yet firm consistency created a gentle break between bites, shaping a rhythm that made meals feel more satisfying. For families that roasted meat frequently, keeping a jar of pickled walnuts on hand became a practical necessity. In wealthier households, pickled walnuts appeared in more formal settings as well. They accompanied cold meats on sideboards during large gatherings, or were included among a selection of condiments intended to complement various dishes. Their dark colour and distinctive aroma set them apart from other pickles or relishes, making them a visually striking addition to the table. Servants placed them in small dishes or cut them into neat pieces, ensuring they fit the refined presentation expected at such events. Their strong flavour provided a contrast to milder accompaniments like bread, butter, or simple vegetables. In working-class homes, pickled walnuts served as an economical means of extending flavours through the year. Since the preparation relied on early-season walnuts that were otherwise difficult to use, families could transform something modest into a long-lasting preserve. The pickles required little maintenance once stored, and remained edible through colder months when fresh options dwindled. This practicality made pickled walnuts a valuable part of domestic routines centered on preservation. Families that prepared large batches could rely on them for many meals, using small quantities at a time to enhance otherwise simple dishes. Despite their unusual nature, pickled walnuts became familiar enough that many households developed strong preferences for how they should be prepared. Some cooks favored heavy spicing, creating a more aromatic pickle. Others preferred a clean, sharp acidity without additional flavors. Cookbooks of the era included multiple variations, reflecting regional tastes and the availability of spices. The diversity of recipes demonstrated how households adapted the dish to suit their resources, making pickled walnuts a flexible component of domestic cooking. The sensory experience of eating pickled walnuts contributed to their enduring appeal. Their dark surface offered a visual hint of depth, while their interior revealed a tender flesh with a slightly grainy texture. The vinegar brought immediate brightness, followed by earthy notes from the walnut itself. When paired with roasted meats, these layers created a balanced combination that elevated the overall meal. Even small amounts of the pickle could transform a plate, showing how preserved foods played important roles in shaping the flavor profile of everyday dishes. As culinary habits changed and newer condiments became more broadly available, the presence of pickled walnuts decreased. Modern tastes shifted toward lighter, fresher accompaniments, and industrially produced condiments replaced many traditional preserves. Yet pickled walnuts remain an intriguing reminder of how households once navigated the limitations of seasonal eating, using creativity and patience to extend flavors across the year. Their distinctive appearance and strong acidity mark them as one of the more memorable preserves in the historical kitchen. Pickled walnuts reveal how households turned unripe fruit into a flavorful accompaniment that brightened heavy meals, using preservation techniques to sustain variety throughout the year. They demonstrate how practicality and culinary instinct combined to create a food that served both everyday needs and moments of special preparation. Pickled walnuts illustrate how preserved foods added lively contrast to meals dominated by dense meats and root vegetables, offering sharp relief with every bite. From these thrifty culinary habits emerged another dish built around leftovers, where families transformed cooked vegetables into a simple fry-up served at the end of long days. Cooking in 19th century households often revolved around the careful use of leftovers, and bubble and squeak emerged as one of the clearest examples of how families transformed yesterday's vegetables into a freshly prepared meal. The dish relied on cooked greens, usually cabbage, mixed with leftover potatoes or other vegetables that had been boiled for previous meals. Once combined, the mixture was pressed into a pan and fried until it developed a browned, crisp surface. The name came from the gentle bubbling and faint squeaking sounds the vegetables made as they cooked in the pan. For families who needed to stretch their food supplies as far as possible, bubble and squeak represented an approach to cooking grounded in practicality, thrift, and the determination to waste nothing. The preparation of bubble and squeak followed a rhythm shaped by the flow of meals throughout the week. Large family dinners often included boiled vegetables served alongside meats, and any leftovers were set aside for future use. Rather than discarding them, cooks saved bits of cabbage, carrots, turnips and potatoes in bowls or plates kept in cool corners of the kitchen. On the following day, these vegetables were chopped roughly and mixed. Cooks added only a little seasoning, relying on the natural flavors of the vegetables themselves. The frying pan became the central tool in this transformation. Butter or dripping coated the bottom of the pan, helping the vegetables develop crisp edges as they fried. Bubble and squeak appealed to households of varying sizes because it required little preparation and made good use of ingredients already on hand. In working-class homes, where budgets were tight and meals needed to be filling, this dish provided a simple but satisfying option. It served as breakfast for some families and as supper for others, depending on the availability of leftovers. Its flexibility allowed cooks to adjust the mixture based on what remained from previous meals, ensuring that nothing went unused. The frying process revived the vegetables, giving them a new texture and warmth, rather than simply reheating them as they were. The dish's flavor depended heavily on the vegetables included and the cook's technique. When pressed firmly into the pan, the mixture developed a crust that contrasted with the softness inside. Some cooks flipped the entire mixture like a large pancake, while others stirred it occasionally to create scattered, browned pieces throughout. The aroma of frying vegetables filled small kitchens, combining earthy cabbage with the richness of cooking fat. This scent, though simple, brought a sense of comfort to families habituated to modest meals. Even with a few ingredients, bubble and squeak offered a sense of completeness through warmth and familiarity. Beyond practicality, the dish reflected a cultural mindset shaped by thrift. Victorian households valued the idea of making full use of what they had, especially when food storage and refrigeration were limited. Throwing away edible food was uncommon, prompting the creation of dishes designed specifically to breathe new life into leftovers. Bubble and squeak became part of this domestic strategy, demonstrating how households navigated limited resources with creativity rather than deprivation. The dish turned scraps into something purposeful, reinforcing the idea that simple ingredients could still provide nourishment and comfort. Bubble and squeak also revealed how cooking traditions formed around repetition. Because leftovers appeared frequently, Families prepared the dish often enough for it to become familiar. Children grew up recognizing the smell of frying greens and potatoes, understanding instinctively that it marked a practical yet comforting meal. In this way, the dish helped shape culinary memory. Even though it relied on vegetables without meat, it carried enough substance to satisfy families accustomed to long days of physical labor. The dish's minimal cost and steady reliability made it a staple during economic hardship, or times when households needed to stretch their supplies further than usual. In some households, bubble and squeak was served alongside small portions of cold meat or gravy, enhancing the flavor of the vegetables without requiring additional cooking. In others, it stood alone, supported only by bread or pickles. This flexibility made the dish suitable for diverse families, whether living in city terraces or rural cottages. Market towns also saw versions of bubble and squeak sold in small eateries where workers sought affordable meals. These versions tended to be heavier on potatoes due to the lower cost, but the essence of the dish remained unchanged. Despite its humble origins, bubble and squeak illustrated a deeper truth about 19th century cooking. Simplicity often carried its own form of satisfaction. Families did not view the dish as a compromise, but rather as a sensible use of what they had. The frying pan, the gentle sizzle of vegetables, and the warmth of the finished dish formed a daily ritual that fit naturally into the structure of domestic life. With each serving, families reaffirmed habits of practicality that allowed them to navigate the limitations of their environment. As modern ingredients and cooking methods became more widely available, dishes like bubble and squeak lost some of their central role in daily meals. Refrigeration, pre-prepared foods, and shifting preferences introduced new options. Yet the dish endures as a reminder of a time when cooking demanded resourcefulness, and where modest vegetables could be transformed into something warm, familiar, and deeply connected to household identity. Bubble and Squeak reveals how households once relied on leftover vegetables to create meals that carried both warmth and practicality, using simple techniques to stretch resources while maintaining comfort. Its presence at the table demonstrates how thrift shaped culinary traditions, grounded in the quiet rhythm of everyday life. Bubble and Squeak illustrates how families turned scraps into sustaining meals through careful frying and steady resourcefulness. As this habit of transforming humble ingredients shaped their tables, attention eventually moved toward richer, organ-based breakfasts, prepared with equal practicality. In those kitchens, lamb's liver and heart were cooked with onions to create a meal that carried far more weight than its simple ingredients suggested. Breakfast in many 19th century homes often began with dishes far richer and heavier than what a modern morning meal might include, and lamb's fry remained one of the most firmly rooted examples of this tradition. The dish relied on slices of lamb liver and heart cooked slowly with onions until the mixture developed a deep, savoury aroma that filled the kitchen with warmth. For families who prepared it, the dish was not unusual or extravagant. It was simply part of the rhythm of daily life, shaped by the availability of organ meats and the need for meals that offered enough energy to sustain long hours of physical work. Through its presence on countless morning tables, lamb's fry revealed how Victorian households relied on practicality rather than delicacy when choosing what to eat at the start of the day. Preparing lamb's fry often began early, when the kitchen was still quiet and the air carried a faint chill. The organs were cleaned and trimmed with care, soaked briefly to soften their sharpness, and cut into manageable pieces that would cook evenly in the pan. Onions were sliced into thin arcs that softened quickly when exposed to heat. They were always added first, because their sweetness formed the foundation of the dish. As the onions cooked, they released a comforting aroma that settled gently through the house. Only once they reached a translucent softness did the liver and heart enter the pan. The pieces sizzled lightly as they browned, absorbing flavour from the onions and providing their own richness in return. Lamb's fry was a practical meal for households that needed nourishment without significant expense. Organ meats were readily available at local butchers and were cheaper than prime cuts of lamb or beef. Families learned to rely on them because they offered substantial nutrition and could be stretched across multiple servings when combined with onions, bread, or potatoes. In many homes, this dish appeared regularly, not because it was a favourite, but because it was dependable. The familiarity of its taste, the ease of its preparation, and the steady comfort it offered made it part of the weekly routine. It provided warmth on cold mornings and left those who ate it feeling prepared for the tasks ahead. The dish's flavour came from the balance between the strong notes of the organ meats and the softer sweetness of the onions. When cooked slowly, the liver remained tender, while the heart provided a firmer bite. The onions softened around the meat, coating each piece with a subtle layer of sweetness that transformed the dish from something purely functional into something satisfying. A small sprinkle of salt and pepper was usually enough to finish it. In some homes, flour was added to create a thicker texture, while a splash of broth ensured the mixture never became too dry. These small adjustments allowed each family to shape the dish according to their preferences, while keeping its essence unchanged. Breakfast dishes like lamb's fry revealed the realities of Victorian domestic life. People often worked long hours in physically demanding roles, and morning meals needed to reflect that. A light breakfast was not practical for individuals who spent their days in fields, workshops, or service positions. Lamb's fry filled the stomach and provided enough strength to begin the day with purpose. Even those who worked within the home relied on meals like this to maintain their energy while managing chores that stretched from dawn to dusk. The presence of organ meats in everyday meals also reflected a broader cultural approach to food. Victorian households practiced a complete use philosophy, ensuring that no part of an animal went to waste. Liver, heart, kidney, and other organs were viewed as ordinary ingredients rather than unusual or undesirable. This perspective emerged from necessity, but also from the belief that proper cooking techniques could transform these ingredients into nourishing meals. Dishes like lamb's fry embodied this idea, turning affordable organs into something warm and filling. In addition to its practicality, lamb's fry carried a certain sense of memory for many families. Children who grew up smelling the aroma of liver and onions frying in the early morning often remembered it long into adulthood. The scent signaled the beginning of the day, the reassuring presence of a parent at the stove, and the quiet rhythm of breakfast before work and school. Even if tastes changed over time, the associations remained gentle and familiar. For some, it became a nostalgic reminder of a household that used simple ingredients to create stability. As decades passed and culinary preferences shifted, organ-based dishes began to fade from daily meals. Refrigeration, improved access to fresh cuts of meat, and the rise of processed foods altered the structure of breakfast. What once felt ordinary gradually became rare. Lamb's fry moved from being a morning staple to an occasional dish made for those who still appreciated its simple richness. Yet its presence in historical cookbooks and family memories preserved its place within the broader story of Victorian food culture. The dish's lingering significance lies in the way it illustrates the intersection of economy, necessity, and comfort. Lamb's fry required little more than a pan, a small amount of fat, and ingredients that were easy to obtain. It demonstrated how families adapted to the resources available to them, creating meals that balanced nourishment and practicality. Even though tastes evolved, the dish remained a quiet symbol of resilience in kitchens where every ingredient mattered. Lamb's fry shows how organ meats once played a central role in morning meals, offering warmth and strength to households shaped by demanding routines. Through its steady presence, the dish reflected a time when practicality guided the choices made at the breakfast table. Lamb's fry reveals how families used inexpensive organs to create breakfast dishes that delivered both comfort and energy. As household tastes continued to shift, attention turned towards simpler meals built around leftover bread, softened gently with warm milk. In many Victorian households, the end of a formal meal unfolded in a slow, deliberate order, and Stilton savoury held a distinctive place within that sequence. Instead of moving directly from the main course to dessert, diners were often served a small, flavourful dish meant to bridge the transition. Stilton savoury fulfilled exactly this purpose. Made from Stilton cheese, combined with gentle spices or a touch of mustard, it offered a final burst of richness before the sweetness of the trifle or pudding that followed. This dish was not meant to be filling. It existed to prepare the palate, to create a smooth passage from savoury dishes to the softer flavours of dessert, leaving diners aware of each stage of the meal's progression. Preparing Stilton savoury required a few ingredients but careful attention. Stilton cheese, known for its crumbly texture and deep flavour, formed the base. The cheese was mashed until soft, often mixed with a little butter to create a spreadable consistency. Tiny amounts of cayenne, mustard, or pepper were added to awaken the flavour without overwhelming it. In some homes, cooks shaped the mixture into small rounds and placed them under gentle heat to warm slightly. In others, it was simply served as a paste on thin toast. The warmth allowed the cheese to soften further, releasing an aroma that drifted through the dining room and signalled the quiet interlude before dessert. This dish reflected the Victorian preference for structure and formality in dining. Meals were not rushed. Each course appeared in a predetermined order that conveyed refinement and attention to detail. Stilton savoury belonged to that system. Its presence after the main course suggested that the meal was not yet approaching closure, but rather shifting into a softer phase. Victorians believed that transitions in food should be smooth, and the savoury course served as a bridge between two contrasting flavours. Even in modest homes, where meals were simpler, the idea of moving gradually from savoury to sweet was familiar enough that dishes like this occasionally appeared at the end of Sunday dinners. What made Stilton savoury particularly notable was the flavour of the cheese itself. Stilton carried a deep earthiness, mild sharpness, and subtle saltiness that stood apart from other cheeses commonly used in cooking. When combined with spices, the mixture became rich without feeling heavy. The small serving size allowed diners to enjoy the intensity without lingering fullness. It was a dish that invited small bites rather than large portions, encouraging diners to enjoy it slowly. This approach aligned naturally with Victorian dining habits, which valued pacing and the ability to appreciate each stage of the meal. The dish also reflected the availability and symbolism of cheese in Victorian society. Stilton, although not extremely rare, was associated with quality and tradition. Serving it at the end of a meal suggested that the household valued established customs and took pride in presenting their guests with something both familiar and refined. It was an ingredient that carried a sense of English identity. Many cookbooks of the era included recipes for savoury dishes using Stilton, showing how deeply the flavour was woven into culinary expectations. At home, the dish created a moment of calm in the rhythm of the meal. After consuming richer foods, diners experienced a pause when the savoury course arrived. The small plate, the warm toast, and the light aroma created a gentle slowing of pace. Conversations softened and people took their time, allowing the dish to act as a quiet interval. The warmth of the cheese and the mild kick of seasoning lifted the senses, preparing them for the sweetness that would follow. It was not a dramatic moment, but rather a subtle one, rooted in the Victorian tendency to create structure even within the simplest actions. Although simple, the dish demonstrated how Victorians approached hospitality. Meals were designed to convey care, attention, and an understanding of etiquette. Serving Stilton savoury showed that the host considered the comfort and experience of the diners. Even in smaller gatherings, where meals were less ornate, bringing out a savoury course reflected thoughtfulness. It was a way of honouring guests while maintaining the pattern of formal dining. The dish bridged the gap between necessity and intention, transforming a piece of cheese into an expected ritual. Over time, dining customs changed, and the savoury course gradually faded from everyday meals. Modern households often move directly from the main course to dessert, skipping the gentle intermediary step that once held such importance. As refrigerators, processed foods, and new eating habits emerged, the tradition of serving Stilton savoury lost its place in daily routines. Yet its presence in historical menus, recipe books, and personal recollections remains a reminder of the Victorian appreciation for order and subtlety in food. The dish now survives mostly as a historical footnote, a small marker of how people once organised their meals according to patterns designed to guide the senses. While the idea of a savoury course may seem unfamiliar today, its purpose was clear within the context of Victorian dining. It created continuity, prevented abrupt changes in flavour, and brought a sense of composure to the table. In its quiet way, it embodied the Victorian belief that even the smallest details of a meal mattered. Stilton savoury reveals how a simple mixture of cheese and spices shaped the transition between courses, offering a moment of balance and warmth within structured Victorian meals. Through its gentle presence, it reflects a dining culture built on steadiness, order, and the pleasure of gradual change. Stilton savoury shows how Victorians used small, flavourful dishes to guide the flow of a meal before sweetness arrived. With this gentle structure shaping their evenings, attention eventually moved toward the delicate biscuits once served with wine during afternoon gatherings. Among the many small treats that appeared on Victorian tables, ratafia biscuits held a gentle but memorable place, offering a sweetness that felt light rather than overwhelming. Made from finely ground almonds mixed with a small amount of sugar and egg white, the biscuits developed a crisp exterior and a soft, fragrant centre. Their delicate almond aroma drifted through parlours and dining rooms during afternoon gatherings, becoming part of the quiet rituals that shaped social life. Ratafia biscuits were neither extravagant nor elaborate. Instead, they represented a type of elegance rooted in simplicity, making them a familiar presence in homes that valued small refinements in daily meals. The preparation of ratafia biscuits followed a simple process. Almonds were crushed or ground until they formed a fine, even texture. When mixed with sugar and egg whites, the mixture became smooth enough to pipe or shape into small rounds. Once baked, the biscuits hardened slightly, leaving behind a texture that combined crispness with a soft centre. This contrasted gently with the heavier pastries and cakes often served during celebrations. The almond flavour was subtle but unmistakable, creating a sense of comfort that fit naturally within Victorian tea rituals. Although the recipe required few ingredients, the quality of the almonds influenced the taste, making even a small batch of biscuits feel special. Ratafia biscuits became especially associated with wine because their flavour paired well with both sweet and fortified varieties. During gatherings, hosts often offered these biscuits alongside glasses of dessert wine to create a harmonious blend of mild sweetness and almond richness. The biscuits softened slightly when dipped into wine, creating a delicate combination that many Victorians enjoyed. This pairing reflected the era's appreciation for gentle contrasts in texture and flavour. It also demonstrated the importance placed on presentation and pacing, as small treats like ratafia biscuits were brought out at precise moments to complement the experience of drinking. The biscuits also became a familiar part of afternoon tea, a practice that grew increasingly central to Victorian social life. Tea gatherings were not merely opportunities to drink tea, but moments of conversation, relaxation, and social connection. Small plates of ratafia biscuits appeared alongside other light treats such as sponge cakes, seed cakes, or thinly sliced bread and butter. Their modest size and mild sweetness made them ideal for these settings, where guests were encouraged to enjoy small bites without interrupting the flow of conversation. Because they were easy to store and transport, the biscuits could be prepared in advance or purchased from local bakeries, making them accessible to households of various backgrounds. What made ratafia biscuits endure in memory was their balance of simplicity and refinement. They did not require the elaborate decoration seen in some Victorian desserts, nor the strong flavours found in others. Instead, they offered a quiet sweetness that felt gentle and familiar. For children, the biscuits often served as early introductions to almond flavours, while adults associated them with peaceful moments of conversation or the soft end of an evening meal. Their association with wine added an element of sophistication without overwhelming the senses, fitting neatly within Victorian expectations for modest indulgence. In cookbooks of the era, recipes for ratafia biscuits appeared frequently and in several variations. Some called for bitter almonds to deepen the flavour, though these required careful preparation, while others relied entirely on sweet almonds to create a milder taste. A few versions included a small amount of flour to adjust the texture, but many remained true to the original simplicity of almonds, egg whites, and sugar. These recipes reflected the broader Victorian emphasis on transforming basic ingredients into refined dishes through careful preparation rather than excess. Within the structure of Victorian meals, ratafia biscuits filled a space that connected social customs with culinary habits. Their presence at tea gatherings illustrated how food functioned as both nourishment and a social tool. Offering guests a plate of small biscuits, light enough not to spoil an appetite, sweet enough to enhance a moment, became an act of hospitality that required little effort yet carried meaning. The biscuits' delicate appearance conveyed attentiveness, while their almond aroma created a sense of calm that suited conversations stretching into late afternoons. Over time, however, changes in taste and the rise of industrial baking shifted preferences away from traditional almond-based treats. New types of biscuits, mass-produced and less expensive, entered the market and gradually replaced handmade varieties. Ratafia biscuits, once common, became associated more with nostalgia than with regular household use. Their subtle flavour and handmade texture contrasted sharply with the stronger flavours and crisp uniformity of modern packaged biscuits. As a result, they slipped quietly out of everyday life, preserved only in old recipe books and faint childhood memories. Yet the significance of ratafia biscuits lies in the way they reveal the gentle sophistication of Victorian eating habits. These biscuits represented a moment of pause within the day, a small pleasure shared in quiet rooms with soft light and light conversation. They showed how sweetness could be modest and still hold importance within social rituals. Their almond fragrance and delicate structure served as reminders that elegance did not require extravagance, only intention. Ratafia biscuits reflect a time when small, lightly sweetened treats shaped the rhythm of social gatherings, offering a calm and familiar presence on tables during tea or wine. Through their modest appearance and subtle flavour, they captured a gentle moment in Victorian culinary life. Ratafia biscuits illustrate how simple almond confections once supported social rituals built around tea and wine, adding light sweetness to familiar gatherings. Once these gentle traditions had taken root in daily life, attention gradually shifted toward the broader lessons hidden within the rise and disappearance of such delicacies across time. Looking back at the many dishes that once filled Victorian kitchens and dining rooms, it becomes clear that food tells a softer and often more revealing story than written history alone. The meals people prepared, the ingredients they valued, and the flavours they embraced were shaped deeply by their living conditions, their access to resources, and their understanding of nutrition. Tastes shifted as knowledge expanded, and dishes that once felt ordinary gradually became unfamiliar curiosities. Through this slow progression, we begin to see how culinary habits mirror the evolution of society itself. The delicacies that once appeared regularly on Victorian tables now stand as tender reminders of how people adapted to the world around them, creating meals that offered comfort, nourishment, and sometimes a brief moment of pleasure amid demanding lives. Food during the Victorian era was influenced by factors that touched every part of daily existence. Industrialisation altered the way ingredients were produced and transported, making some foods more accessible, while pushing others into decline. Scientific advances began to change how people understood health, encouraging shifts in diet that transformed the meaning of nourishment. Social class shapes not only what people ate, but how meals were served, who prepared them, and how much structure surrounded even the simplest breakfast or evening dish. Within these patterns, each delicacy told its own quiet story. Mock turtle soup reflected the desire for luxury without the cost of true extravagance. Jellied eels showed the resilience of working-class ingenuity. Blancmange illustrated the fascination with smooth textures and refined presentation. Each dish contributed a thread to the larger fabric of Victorian culinary life. When we consider why certain foods disappeared, the reasons often trace back to changing values. Organ meats, once widely used because no part of an animal could be wasted, faded as economic conditions improved and refrigeration made different cuts of meat more accessible. Dishes like fish custard or brain fritters became less common because their flavours no longer aligned with evolving preferences. Some delicacies relied on time-consuming preparation, and as lifestyles grew busier and more modernised, fewer households continued traditions that required slow, careful work. Even the structure of meals changed. The savoury course that once bridged the gap between the main dish and dessert disappeared as dining habits simplified. The foods themselves remained the same, but the world around them shifted too quickly for them to hold their place. The disappearance of these delicacies also reveals how nostalgia shapes the way we look back. At the time, many of these dishes were simply practical or ordinary. They were not meant to be treasured, but used, consumed, and replaced. Yet with distance, they become markers of identity, illustrating how families made do with what they had, how they approached hospitality, and how they created comfort using the ingredients available to them. Even the simplest dishes held meaning in context. Bubble and squeak was more than leftover vegetables fried together. It represented thrift and the ability to find satisfaction in modest meals. Lamb's fry was more than organ meat and onions. It was a morning staple that supported long days of physical work. These foods mattered not for their extravagance, but for the roles they played in ordinary lives. Understanding Victorian delicacies also helps us appreciate the way culture influences taste. What seems unusual or unappealing to modern diners may once have been celebrated or even considered fashionable. Foods gain and lose value depending on trends, availability, and the collective imagination of a society. Oyster patties disappeared not because oysters became less delicious, but because oysters themselves became scarce and expensive. Pickled walnuts fell out of favour as fresher foods became easier to store and transport. Even biscuits flavoured with almonds, once refined enough for tea gatherings, slowly made room for mass-produced alternatives. These shifts remind us that taste is not fixed, but continually shaped by the world we live in. Looking at these dishes side by side, a deeper lesson emerges. Food is a reflection of adaptation. People find ways to use what they have, to create comfort with limited means, and to stretch ingredients into forms that suit their needs. Victorian cooks displayed remarkable creativity, transforming inexpensive cuts, preserved ingredients, and imported spices into meals that supported families across every social level. Their dishes reveal problem-solving, resourcefulness, and the desire to enjoy moments of flavour, even when circumstances were difficult. Every delicacy, no matter how strange it may now seem, was an answer to a particular moment in history. As these foods faded, they left behind quiet stories about resilience and change. They show how people responded to scarcity, how they embraced abundance when it became available, and how they shaped traditions around the act of eating together. They remind us that culinary history is not only about recipes, but about the people who prepared them, the labour that went into each dish, and the memories that lingered long after a plate was cleared. When we explore forgotten Victorian delicacies, we uncover lessons about how society evolves. Tastes adjust to new knowledge. Eating habits shift with new technologies. What feels ordinary today may become a relic tomorrow. Through these changes, we see clearly that food is not static. It grows with us, moves with us, and sometimes disappears when the world no longer needs it. Victorian cuisine reveals that history can be tasted as much as it can be read. Every dish, whether humble or elaborate, carries fragments of a time when food shaped the rhythm of daily life. And through these remnants of flavour, we understand more about the people who came before us, their struggles, their creativity, their desires, and the comfort they sought in familiar meals. Thank you for spending this time exploring a world of flavours now lost to memory, yet still rich in meaning. May the quiet reflections of these forgotten dishes bring you a sense of calm as the day comes to a close. And may your evening settle softly, carrying you toward a peaceful and restful night. Good night and sleep well.